What if the closest star system to Earth is hiding one of the most mysterious alien races ever discussed? The Alpha Centaurians are said to come from the Alpha Centauri system, our nearest stellar neighbor, and some theories describe them as advanced beings watching humanity from just a few light years away. But their story goes beyond space. Some believe the Alpha Centaurians may have an agenda connected to human evolution, consciousness, and future contact. So are they peaceful observers, hidden guides, or simply another alien myth inspired by the stars? In this video, we explore the origins, agenda, and hidden mysteries behind the Alpha Centaurian alien race. There is a point of light in the southern sky that human beings have observed for as long as they have had eyes capable of turning upward. It burns steadily, golden and unblinking, outshining every star visible from most of the inhabited world except for a handful of luminaries that hold dominion over particular seasons. For thousands of years, navigators tracked it as a beacon. Poets wrote about it. Indigenous cultures across 3 continents wove it into cosmologies that still survive in fragmentary form. That point of light is Alpha Centauri, or more precisely, the blended visual impression of a triple star system located approximately 4.37 light-years from our own sun, the single closest stellar neighborhood to the one we inhabit. And if even a fraction of what thousands of researchers, whistleblowers, abductees, ancient text interpreters, and classified document leakers have claimed over the past century is true, then that glowing point in the southern sky is not merely the nearest star. It is the origin point of one of the most advanced civilizations in the known galaxy, a civilization that has been watching Earth for an almost incomprehensible span of time, that may have intervened directly in human evolution, that maintains a covert presence on this planet right now, and whose long-term agenda for humanity remains one of the most contested and disturbing questions in the entire field of extraterrestrial research. This documentary is not going to ask you to simply believe any of that. What it is going to do is lay out the full body of evidence, archaeological, testimonial, astronomical, historical, biological, and deeply strange, and let you weigh it yourself. Because the subject of the Alpha Centaurians, sometimes called the Centaurians, sometimes called the Nordics, sometimes called the Tall Whites by certain branches of intelligence and by certain categories of experiencers, is not fringe nonsense circulating at the outer edges of the internet. It is, in fact, one of the most consistently reported, most internally coherent, and most officially acknowledged categories of alleged extraterrestrial contact in the historical record. Government insiders have spoken about it. Ancient texts from civilizations that had no contact with each other describe beings that match the same profile. The physical evidence, where it exists, points in directions that mainstream science has not satisfactorily explained. And the implications, if any of this is real, are so vast and so world-altering that it is perhaps understandable why the institutions of human civilization have been so reluctant to confront it directly. We begin at the beginning, which in this case is not the beginning of human history, but something considerably older. The Alpha Centauri system is, from the perspective of stellar astrophysics, a remarkable place. It consists of 3 stars: Alpha Centauri A, a G-type yellow star slightly larger and more luminous than our own sun; Alpha Centauri B, a slightly smaller and cooler K-type orange star; and Proxima Centauri, a red dwarf that is technically the closest individual star to Earth at about 4.4 light-years. Alpha Centauri A and B orbit each other in an elliptical binary dance that takes roughly 79.9 years to complete, while Proxima orbits the pair at an enormous distance, possibly not gravitationally bound to them at all in any permanent sense. The system has been of intense scientific interest ever since the early 21st century confirmed what many had long suspected, that there are planets in that system. Proxima B, confirmed in 2016, orbits within the habitable zone of Proxima Centauri. Later research identified additional candidate planets. And while Proxima's status as a violent, flare-prone red dwarf makes surface habitability there questionable under current models, the conditions around Alpha Centauri A and B, more stable, more sun-like, more amenable to the chemistry of life as we understand it, remain an open question. What mainstream science does not yet definitively know is whether habitable planets orbit Alpha Centauri A or B directly. What a very substantial body of alternative research claims, however, is that this question has already been answered, not by our telescopes, but by the beings who live there. The core claim about the Alpha Centaurians, as it emerges from decades of compiled testimonies, channeled communications, alleged government disclosures, and archaeological reinterpretation, is this: that a humanoid species evolved on a planet orbiting Alpha Centauri a world sometimes called Proxima in older contactee literature, a naming convention that predates the astronomical use of the term and should not be confused with the red dwarf star, and more recently referred to in certain briefing-style documents as Meton, or simply the Centaurian homeworld. This species evolved along a biological trajectory similar to Homo sapiens but billions of years earlier, achieving technological civilization at a point when Earth's surface was still dominated by single-celled organisms. The implications of this head start are everything. A civilization that has had even 100,000 more years of scientific and spiritual development than humanity is, by any reasonable extrapolation, so far beyond us that the gap is not merely technological, but ontological. They would relate to us roughly the way we relate to bacteria, except that many accounts insist they do not behave that way, that they regard us with something between parenthood and scientific stewardship, that they have invested deeply in our development, and that their relationship to this planet is not incidental, but foundational. This is the central mystery. Why would an advanced civilization from the nearest star system be so consistently and specifically concerned with one small, troubled, technologically primitive planet orbiting a modest star at the edge of one galactic arm? The answers that have been proposed fall into several categories, and this documentary will examine each of them. But first, we need to establish who these beings reportedly are, what they look like, how they have been described across cultures and across time, and why the convergence of those descriptions from sources that could not possibly have been in contact with each other constitutes one of the most compelling evidential puzzles in the entire field. The physical description of Alpha Centaurian beings in modern contactee and abduction literature is remarkably consistent. They are reported as tall, typically between 6 and 7 feet in height. Though some accounts go higher, they are humanoid in the fullest sense, bilaterally symmetrical, bipedal, with 2 arms, a head positioned atop a neck, facial features broadly recognizable as analogous to human ones. Their skin is described as pale to the point of near translucence in some accounts, with an almost luminous quality, though other reports describe a more normal Caucasian tone. Their eyes are large, blue or blue-violet, or occasionally golden in color, and are described in virtually every close encounter report as extraordinarily expressive and deeply unsettling to look into. Not threatening, but overwhelming, as though the depth of consciousness behind them is simply too vast for the human nervous system to process comfortably. Their hair is light, blonde to white, and their facial features are described as refined, high-cheekboned, angular, and strikingly beautiful by human aesthetic standards, though in a way that reads as slightly wrong, slightly too perfect, like a statue that has been brought to motion. They wear, in many accounts, close-fitting suits of a material that seems to manage light in unusual ways, sometimes described as silver or white, or as shifting subtly depending on the angle of observation. What is remarkable is that this description does not originate with the UFO contactee movement of the 1950s. It is considerably older. The Nordic archetype, tall, fair, luminous beings of extraordinary intelligence and spiritual authority who interact with selected humans and communicate messages of cosmic importance, runs through ancient literature, religious tradition, and mythological record like a continuous thread whose age can be traced back thousands of years. The challenge, of course, is that historians and anthropologists have their own explanations for these traditions, rooted in cultural evolution, symbolic thinking, and the psychological needs of pre-scientific societies. But the specificity of the physical descriptions and the behavioral patterns that accompany them, and the technological capabilities attributed to these beings, and the content of the information they allegedly conveyed, all of these resist easy dismissal as mere symbolic invention. Let us begin with Sumer, because Sumer is where the paper trail gets thickest. The Sumerian civilization arose in Mesopotamia, in what is now southern Iraq, roughly 6,000 years ago. It was, by any measure, an astonishing emergence, a fully formed urban culture with writing, mathematics, astronomy, sophisticated law, complex theology, and architectural achievement that appeared with a rapidity that still puzzles archaeologists. The conventional explanation involves the gradual aggregation of prior agricultural cultures and the stimulus of trade. The alternative explanation, advanced most famously by the late scholar Zecharia Sitchin, but developed independently by dozens of other researchers drawing on the original cuneiform tablets, is that Sumerian civilization did not merely arise rapidly, it was seeded and guided by beings of extraterrestrial origin. Sitchin's work is controversial and has been extensively criticized by mainstream academics who point to genuine errors in his translations. But the core observation that drove his research, that the Sumerian texts describe, in remarkable detail, contact with beings who possess technology, knowledge, and physical capabilities far beyond anything a human civilization of that era could have possessed, is not Sitchin's invention. It is in the texts. The Anunnaki, as these beings are called in Sumerian tradition, are described as arriving from the sky in craft that roar and shine, as possessing knowledge of the stars that includes details about the outer planets that Sumerian naked-eye astronomy had no means of deriving, as having lifespans of enormous length, as being physically different from humans in height and radiance, and as having a complex political and social structure that the texts describe in considerable detail over thousands of years of recorded interaction. The question that concerns us directly is whether the Anunnaki of Sumerian tradition are the same beings as the Alpha Centaurians of modern contactee and research literature. The answer is, possibly, but the relationship is complicated. Some researchers argue that the Anunnaki represent a different extraterrestrial group entirely, potentially of Syrian or Nibiru-related origin if one accepts Sitchin's planetary hypothesis, or of a different stellar lineage altogether. Others argue that the Anunnaki and the Alpha Centaurians are the same species operating under different cultural appellations across different historical periods. And a third interpretation, which we will develop more fully later in this documentary, holds that the relationship between Alpha Centaurians and the Anunnaki is not one of identity, but of conflict. That two different extraterrestrial civilizations have been active on Earth for thousands of years, that they have different agendas and different relationships to humanity, and that much of what is encoded in ancient myth and religion represents the documented aftermath of that cosmic conflict played out in human history. What is not in dispute within the body of this research is that the beings described in Sumerian texts share specific physical and behavioral characteristics with the beings described in Alpha Centaurian contact reports: the height, the luminosity, the advanced knowledge, the interest in genetics and biology, the conveyed sense of being both deeply concerned with humanity and operating according to a plan that humanity does not fully understand, the tendency to work through selected human intermediaries rather than making public mass visible contact. These are consistent threads that run from the earliest written records to the most recent declassified intelligence documents and witness testimonies. Before we move forward in time, it is worth spending a moment on the astronomical knowledge that the Sumerians possessed, because it is one of the most difficult aspects of their civilization to explain under conventional models. The Sumerians knew the correct order of all the planets in the solar system, including the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, that are not visible to the naked eye and were not rediscovered by modern astronomy until 1781, 1846, and 1930 respectively. They knew the approximate diameter of these planets. They described the asteroid belt as the debris field of a destroyed planet. They had a model of stellar motion and planetary precession that was not equaled in its sophistication by Western astronomy until centuries after the Renaissance. They described the sun as a star among stars, rather than the center of a cosmically unique system, and they attributed this knowledge directly to the Anunnaki, beings who had come from the sky and had given them the gift of civilization, including the gift of understanding the heavens. There are only two rational explanations for this. Either the Sumerians somehow derived this astronomical knowledge through means we have not yet reconstructed, which would itself be a scientific revolution in our understanding of ancient human capability, or they were told. If they were told, the beings who told them had means of astronomical observation that far exceeded human naked eye capability, and if those beings had astronomical technology of that order, which implies space travel, which implies interstellar capability, then we are not talking about an advanced human culture. We are talking about something else entirely. This is the logical foundation on which the edifice of Alpha Centaurian research rests. It does not require faith. It requires only an honest accounting of what the evidence shows and a willingness to follow that evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere that the current institutional framework of science and governance cannot accommodate. The Egyptian connection to this lineage of inquiry is equally striking, though it manifests in different ways. Ancient Egypt maintained one of the most sophisticated astronomical traditions in the pre-scientific world, and its theology was organized to a remarkable degree around stellar associations, in particular around the 3 stars of Orion's belt and around Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. The alignment of the Great Pyramid shafts with specific stars, the correspondence between the Giza Plateau layout and the Orion's belt configuration, and the profound theological significance of stellar cycles in Egyptian religion are all well-documented facts, whatever interpretation one places on them. What is less commonly noted in mainstream Egyptological discussion is the extent to which Egyptian sacred texts describe contact with beings who match the Alpha Centaurian profile. The Neteru, the divine beings who presided over creation and civilization in Egyptian theology, are not uniformly described as human. They vary in form, but a significant subset of them is described in ways that match the tall, luminous, fair-featured profile that characterizes Alpha Centaurian reports. The Aku, a category of beings associated with starlight and the celestial realm, connected specifically to the concept of transformation and ascension, are described in the pyramid texts and the Book of the Dead in terms that researchers like Robert Temple, Graham Hancock, and numerous independent scholars have noted correspond with unusual specificity to the behaviors and characteristics attributed to extraterrestrial visitors in modern contact accounts. The pyramid texts themselves, which are the oldest known religious texts in the world and date to the 24th and 25th centuries BCE, describe the deceased pharaoh ascending to join the Aku in the sky, traveling among the stars, and encountering beings there who existed on a different order of reality than human beings. The language is sometimes interpreted as pure metaphor and religious symbolism, but other passages are so physically specific, describing the mechanics of ascent, the nature of the celestial landscape, the characteristics of the beings encountered, that the metaphor interpretation begins to strain under the weight of the detail. What we are looking at across these ancient traditions is a consistent pattern of human cultures in direct or mediated contact with beings they regarded as coming from the sky, possessing knowledge and capabilities beyond human attainment, being associated with specific stars or star systems, and guiding human civilization along pathways that served agendas those humans only partially understood. The identification of Alpha Centauri specifically as the origin point of these beings is a more modern refinement. It comes primarily from the contactee literature of the 20th century and from certain claimed government disclosures, but the underlying pattern it seeks to explain is ancient. We will return to Egypt and to other ancient cultures in Part 2. But before we close this opening section, we need to address the question of why Alpha Centauri specifically. Among the hundreds of stars close enough to Earth to make interstellar travel even theoretically plausible, why does the research literature converge so consistently on this one system? The answer has several components. The first is simple proximity. At 437 light-years, the Alpha Centauri system is by far the closest stellar neighbor to our own sun, and any civilization capable of interstellar travel would find Earth far more accessible from there than from any other stellar origin point. The second is the nature of the stars themselves. Alpha Centauri. A is so similar to our own Sun that the stellar environments of the two systems would have comparable chemistry, producing life forms with broadly similar biological foundations. A civilization that evolved in an Alpha Centauri A-like environment would find Earth's solar environment familiar and physiologically compatible in ways that beings from, say, a red dwarf system would not. But the third reason is the most compelling, and it comes directly from the testimonies of those who claim to have been in contact with these beings. Multiple independent contactees, operating in different countries, different decades, and different cultural contexts, report having been told directly, by the beings themselves, that they are from the Alpha Centauri system. This is not derived from astronomical speculation. It is a direct claim, repeated across independent accounts, that these beings make about their own origin when asked or when communicating such information serves the purposes of whatever interaction is taking place. The consistency of that self-identification across sources that demonstrably could not have coordinated their accounts is itself a significant datum that demands explanation. The first modern wave of Alpha Centaurian contact reports begins in the late 1940s, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War and the first public awareness of what we now call the UFO phenomenon. But to understand why that wave emerged when it did, why it was that decade and not another, we need to understand the context of what was happening in the skies above Earth and in the classified laboratories of the world's major military powers at that time. That context is darker and stranger than most people realize, and it connects directly to the question of Alpha Centaurian agenda in ways that are not immediately obvious, but become unavoidable once the full picture is assembled. The year 1947 was not merely the year of Roswell. It was the year that multiple independent observers around the world began reporting encounters with craft whose performance characteristics, acceleration, maneuverability, speed, and apparent disregard for aerodynamic principles, made them identifiable as non-human technology. It was also the year that the United States military, in the immediate aftermath of the most destructive war in human history, was in the process of acquiring German rocket science and engineering through Operation Paperclip and was conducting its first atmospheric tests of nuclear weapons. The connection between nuclear testing and increased UFO activity is a correlation that has been documented across decades and across national boundaries. Whatever else they are, the beings who pilot non-human craft appear to take a specific and documented interest in nuclear weapons technology, appearing over testing sites, appearing over storage facilities, appearing over missile silos and submarines in numbers, and with frequencies that cannot be explained as coincidence. The Alpha Centaurian hypothesis regarding this nuclear interest is one of the most consistently reported elements of their alleged agenda. It will be developed at length in later parts of this documentary. For now, it is enough to note that the 1947 wave of sightings and encounters, the opening of what we might call the modern chapter of Alpha Centaurian human contact, occurred precisely at the moment when humanity first demonstrated the capacity for self-annihilation on a planetary scale. If there is a civilization that has been monitoring this planet for thousands of years, and that regards humanity as something between a ward and an experiment and a younger sibling civilization, the detonation of nuclear weapons would be the single most alarming event in that civilization's long observation of Earth. It would be, quite literally, the moment when the situation changed and a new level of direct engagement became necessary. That is the interpretive framework within which the modern Alpha Centaurian contact phenomenon has to be understood. Not as a sudden arrival, not as first contact, but as a shift in the nature and intensity of an engagement that has been ongoing for an almost incomprehensible period of time. The beings did not come to Earth in 1947. They had been here, or near here, or monitoring from a distance for far longer than any living human tradition can clearly remember. What changed in 1947 was the urgency. And that urgency, according to almost every source that addresses it, has only grown in the decades since. Ancient encounters, the written record of contact. The oldest texts that bear on the question of Alpha Centaurian contact are not the Sumerian tablets, though those are the most detailed and the most famous. They are something older and stranger, the oral traditions of cultures that developed in isolation from the great river valley civilizations, cultures that preserved their cosmological knowledge in forms that were only partially transcribed when outside observers finally arrived to record them. Among these, three stand out for the specificity and consistency of their accounts: the Dogon of West Africa, the Aboriginal Australians, and the ancient Vedic tradition of the Indian subcontinent. Each of these traditions contains elements that, when examined carefully, cannot be easily explained without reference to contact with beings who possessed astronomical and scientific knowledge that was not available to human beings through any conventional means at the time. The Dogon case is probably the most famous in this context, largely because it was documented in detail by Western anthropologists Marcel Griaule and Germain Dieterlen in the 1930s and published in a landmark paper in 1950. What Griaule and Dieterlen found when they spent extended time with Dogon elders who agreed to share the deepest levels of their sacred astronomical knowledge was a system of cosmological understanding that included accurate knowledge of Sirius as a binary star system, including the existence of Sirius B, the white dwarf companion of Sirius A, which is invisible to the naked eye and was not confirmed by Western astronomy until 1862, when Alvin Graham Clark first observed it with a powerful telescope. The Dogon not only knew that Sirius had an invisible companion, they knew that this companion was small and dense, composed of the heaviest material in existence. They knew its orbital period around Sirius A with an accuracy that matches modern measurements. They knew about a third body in the Sirius system that Western astronomy has only recently begun to consider seriously, and they attributed all of this knowledge to beings called the Nommo, whom they described as amphibious, fish-like beings who had come to Earth from the sky in a spinning craft that made a thundering noise when it landed, who had given humanity the gift of civilization and knowledge, and whose origin they associated with a region of the sky that corresponds with both Sirius and, significantly, with the general direction of the Alpha Centauri system. The Dogon case has been attacked and defended at great length. Skeptics have argued that Griaule contaminated his informants with prior knowledge, that the precision of the astronomical data has been overstated, that later revisits to the Dogon found the knowledge less consistent than originally claimed. Defenders of the case have noted that the contamination hypothesis requires implausible levels of coincidence in the specific technical details reported, that the internal cosmological logic of the Dogon system is too complex and too internally consistent to be the product of casual information transfer, and that the skeptical revisits failed to engage with the elders who hold the deepest levels of the tradition. Neither side has definitively settled the argument. What remains, however, is the core datum, a West African oral tradition, isolated from European astronomical knowledge, contained accurate scientific information about the nearest bright star system to the Sun that human technology could not have derived through naked eye observation. The significance for our purposes is not primarily whether the Nommo were Alpha Centaurians specifically. It is that the Dogon tradition represents one of many instances of isolated human cultures possessing detailed knowledge of stellar systems that they attribute directly to contact with non-human beings. Whether those beings are the same in each case, or whether they represent different civilizations with different but partially overlapping knowledge bases, is a secondary question. The primary question, whether non-human beings with advanced astronomical knowledge have been interacting with human cultures across different continents and different historical periods, receives a strong affirmative answer from the Dogon data, whatever specific origin we assign to those beings. The Aboriginal Australian traditions are in some ways even more remarkable, because they are older, because they have been less contaminated by contact with outside astronomical knowledge, and because they preserve, in certain instances, a level of cosmological detail that defies conventional explanation. The Aboriginal people of Australia have maintained continuous oral traditions that they date, and that archaeologists now tentatively support as being the oldest continuous cultural traditions on Earth, spanning potentially 60,000 years of unbroken transmission. Within those traditions, certain groups preserve detailed knowledge of star systems, stellar characteristics, and celestial phenomena that Western science has only recently confirmed. The Wardaman people, for example, maintain traditions about the Southern Cross, about the Magellanic Clouds, and about specific binary star relationships that match modern astronomical data with a precision that has genuinely surprised contemporary astronomers who have worked with Aboriginal elders to document this knowledge. More relevantly for our investigation, several Aboriginal traditions describe encounters with beings who came from the sky, the so-called sky heroes or sky ancestors, who are physically described in ways that match the Alpha Centaurian profile. Tall, luminous beings with unusual eyes, who arrived in craft of various described forms, who possessed knowledge of the land and stars far beyond human capacity, and who shaped early human culture in specific ways. The Wandjina figures, depicted in ancient rock art across northwestern Australia in imagery that has been dated to thousands of years of continuous tradition, are among the most striking of these. The Wandjina are depicted as tall, large-eyed, white-faced beings without mouths, surrounded by halos or aureoles. Their physical appearance, when compared systematically to modern descriptions of the tall, pale, large-eyed beings reported in Alpha Centaurian contact accounts, is so similar that researchers have spent decades arguing about whether the resemblance is coincidental, culturally derived, or the result of actual contact with the same category of beings. The Aboriginal elders who have spoken to researchers about the Wandjina traditions are consistent on certain points. The Wandjina came from the sky. They shaped the landscape and the culture. They are not merely mythological figures, but real beings who have continued to interact with Aboriginal people in less overt ways into historical and, in some accounts, even contemporary times. And they will return. That is a consistent element of Wandjina tradition, that these beings periodically withdraw and periodically return, that their presence ebbs and flows according to cycles that human beings do not fully control or understand. The pattern of departure and return, of cyclical engagement rather than permanent presence, is one of the most consistent features of Alpha Centaurian contact accounts across cultures. We will encounter it repeatedly as we move through the historical record. The Vedic tradition of ancient India is the third major ancient source that demands attention in this context. The Sanskrit texts of the Vedic period, the Rig Veda, the Upanishads, the Mahabharata, and especially the Ramayana and the various Puranas, contain descriptions of beings, craft, and events that have fueled debates about ancient technology and extraterrestrial contact for decades. The Vimanas, flying craft described in various Sanskrit texts, are the most famous element of this, but the beings who pilot or are associated with these craft are in many respects more interesting. The Devas, the divine beings of the Vedic tradition, are described in physical terms that include unusual height, luminous skin, an appearance of extraordinary beauty by human standards, and possession of knowledge and capabilities that mark them as qualitatively different from ordinary human beings. The most specific connection to the Alpha Centaurian profile comes in texts describing certain categories of devas associated with specific star systems. In Vedic cosmology, there is a concept of beings called the rishis, enlightened beings who exist at a level of consciousness and knowledge far beyond ordinary human attainment, and certain of these rishis are explicitly described as stellar in origin, as having come from or being associated with specific star systems. The Saptarishi, the seven great rishis, are associated astronomically with the stars of the Great Bear, but other rishis are connected in various texts to other regions of the sky. The characteristics attributed to these stellar rishis, their knowledge of cosmic law, their possession of technology that reads as advanced physics disguised in mythological language, their periodic interventions in human affairs, and their relationship to a larger cosmic order that operates according to principles humans are only beginning to apprehend, all fit the pattern we are tracing. The Vedic description of the Devas includes explicit references to their origin in what the texts call Svargaloka, the celestial realm, but the texts are not purely metaphorical about this. They describe Svargaloka in physical terms, as a place with specific astronomical coordinates, as accessible through vehicles that travel through what the texts call the ether or the heavenly ocean, as having a specific relationship to the terrestrial world that involves both physical visitation and more subtle forms of influence. The distinction between purely religious metaphor and encoded physical description is genuinely difficult to draw in these texts, which is part of what makes them so fascinating and so frustrating to analyze. What the Vedic tradition adds most distinctively to our picture is the moral and spiritual framework that consistently accompanies these beings. The Devas are not merely technologically advanced, they are described as spiritually elevated, as operating from a state of consciousness that is qualitatively different from ordinary human ego consciousness, as embodying principles of dharma or cosmic law that they regard as binding on themselves as well as on humans, and as being engaged in a long-term project of guiding human evolution toward a higher state of being. This is not merely a theological claim. It is a behavioral description that matches, with remarkable consistency, what modern contactees describe when they discuss the manner and communication style of Alpha Centaurian beings. The emphasis on consciousness development, on spiritual as well as technological evolution, on the importance of free will, on the long-term cosmic context of human existence, these are among the most consistently reported themes in Alpha Centaurian contact, and they are themes that the Vedic tradition encoded in elaborate theological form thousands of years ago. Let us turn now to a different category of ancient evidence, one that is simultaneously more physical and more contested: the megaliths. The megalithic tradition, the construction of enormous stone structures at sites distributed across virtually every continent on Earth, concentrated in the period between roughly 10,000 BCE and 2500 BCE, is one of the great unsolved mysteries of archaeology. The conventional explanation for structures like Stonehenge, the Karnak alignments, the megalithic temples of Malta, the stone heads of the Olmec, the statues of Easter Island, the walls of Sacsayhuaman, and the enigmatic platforms of Göbekli Tepe involves the gradual development of human organizational and engineering capability within specific cultural contexts. This explanation has the virtue of not requiring any exotic assumptions. It has the drawback of not adequately accounting for several concrete aspects of these structures. The precision of megalithic construction, the tight-fitting stone joints at Sacsayhuaman and other Peruvian sites that have no mortar and yet resist a knife blade, the mathematical precision of the Giza Plateau's alignment with the cardinal points to a fraction of a degree, the astronomical orientations of sites like Stonehenge and Newgrange that require careful, sophisticated naked-eye observation over generations, is real and is documented. The scale of the undertaking, which in some cases involves moving stones weighing hundreds of tons over distances of many miles, by means that, even with generous application of manpower and the most sophisticated known ancient engineering techniques, remain experimentally difficult to reproduce, is real and is documented. The simultaneous emergence of complex megalithic traditions at sites separated by thousands of miles and apparently without direct contact. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, Stonehenge in England, the Karnak stones in France, the Malta temples in the Mediterranean, megalithic traditions in Peru, Mexico, Cambodia, India, and Japan is real and is documented. The Alpha Centaurian hypothesis regarding megalithic construction does not claim that these structures were built by alien beings. What it claims, and this is a considerably more subtle and in many ways more interesting proposition, is that they were built by human beings who were following instructions, working from knowledge, and in some cases using tools provided or taught by non-human intelligence. The distinction matters enormously. It does not diminish human achievement to acknowledge that human beings may have had teachers and advisors who possessed knowledge they did not independently derive. Most human learning happens through teaching. The question is not whether the people of the megalithic era had the organizational capacity to build these structures. They clearly did. The question is where they got the knowledge of geometry, astronomy, and material science that informed their designs. The astronomical alignments of megalithic sites constitute perhaps the most telling evidence. Stonehenge aligns with the summer solstice sunrise and winter solstice sunset, Newgrange in Ireland aligns with the winter solstice sunrise with a precision that floods the inner chamber with light for approximately 17 minutes on the solstice. The Goseck Circle in Germany is oriented to solstice sunrises and sunsets. The cairn of Gavrinis in Brittany contains elaborate stone carvings that some researchers interpret as astronomical notation. The alignments at Karnak, while more complex and debated, have been argued to correspond to sophisticated naked-eye observations of lunar cycles. And Göbekli Tepe, the oldest of these sites, predating the others by thousands of years and apparently requiring the organized effort of a complex society at a time when conventional archaeology says no such society existed, shows astronomical alignments whose full significance is still being deciphered. What these sites demonstrate collectively is that the peoples of the megalithic era were engaged in systematic, precise, multi-generational observation of the sky, and that they encoded the results of that observation in stone structures built to last essentially forever. Why? The conventional answer involves religious belief. Solstice ceremonies, agricultural calendars, the marking of sacred times. This is undoubtedly partly true, but researchers who have examined the astronomical knowledge encoded in these sites note that much of it goes beyond what is needed for agricultural calendaring and solstice ritual. The knowledge of precession, the knowledge of specific stellar alignments, the knowledge of long astronomical cycles that play out over thousands of years. This information, encoded in some of these sites, requires an observational program of such duration and precision that it is genuinely difficult to attribute to any spontaneous development of human cultural interest in astronomy. It speaks of teaching, of transmission, of knowledge that came from somewhere and was being preserved in permanent form for reasons that had to do with a time horizon far longer than any individual human life. The connection to Alpha Centaurian contact in this context is not direct but architectural. The hypothesis is that the megalithic sites represent, at least in part, a technology of cosmic communication and orientation, that they were designed with knowledge provided by or in service of an agenda shaped by non-human intelligence that wanted specific astronomical alignments preserved in physical form that would survive across the millennia. The purpose of this preservation varies in different versions of the hypothesis. Some researchers argue it was navigational to allow return to specific points on the planet. Others argue it was astronomical to mark specific cosmic cycles of importance to the visiting civilization. Others argue it was essentially instructional, encoding knowledge for future human generations who would eventually develop the interpretive tools to read it. The Egyptian tradition, which we touched on in part 1, requires deeper examination here because Egypt provides a bridge between the megalithic tradition and the more fully documented historical traditions of contact that emerge from the literate civilizations of the ancient Near East. The alignment of the Giza Plateau has been studied exhaustively. The Great Pyramid's geometric precision, its orientation to the cardinal points within a fraction of a degree, its encoding of pi and phi in its dimensions, its interior passages and chambers aligned with specific stars and stellar events, has been documented by engineers and mathematicians who are not in any sense fringe researchers. The conventional explanation that the Egyptians derived all of this through accumulated empirical observation and geometrical reasoning is possible, but it requires a level of sophistication in Egyptian geometry and astronomy that leaves very little room for the gradual development of these skills within the historical time frame we have for Egyptian civilization. The Sphinx is even more anomalous in certain respects. The water weathering hypothesis proposed by geologist Robert Schoch that the erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure indicate weathering by sustained rainfall rather than wind and sand, and that the last period of sufficient rainfall in the Giza region occurred roughly between 7,000 and 10,000 BCE, would push the construction of the Sphinx back to a date that predates the recognized emergence of Egyptian civilization by several thousand years. If Schoch is right, the Sphinx was built by a civilization or a knowledge tradition that preceded anything in the archaeological record as currently constituted. That does not require extraterrestrial involvement. but it does require a radical revision of our understanding of ancient human capability, a revision that, once made, makes the extraterrestrial hypothesis considerably less extraordinary than it seems against the current conventional baseline. Egyptian hieroglyphic and papyrus texts provide another category of evidence that is directly relevant to the Alpha Centaurian question. The concept of the Neteru, the divine beings who shaped creation, includes beings associated with specific stellar regions, with Sirius being the most prominent. The goddess Isis is associated with Sirius, Osiris with Orion's belt, and various other deities with other specific stars. What is notable is that this is not merely symbolic association. The Egyptians had a doctrine of the Duat, the celestial realm, that is described in physically specific terms, and the pyramid texts describe the king's journey to the Duat as a real journey through a real, if inaccessible, domain. The star shafts in the Great Pyramid, 2 shafts in the King's Chamber and 2 in the Queen's Chamber, are oriented to specific stars, and the most commonly accepted interpretation is that they were intended as conduits for the soul's journey to join specific stellar beings. Whether this is metaphorical theology or physical engineering depends on whether you believe that the beings associated with those stars are real, and that the relationship between them and human souls is something that could be physically facilitated. Robert Bauval's Orion correlation theory, whatever its critics have said about its specific astronomical details, raised a more fundamental question that has not been adequately answered. Why did the ancient Egyptians embed stellar coordinates in their most important architectural monuments? If the answer is purely symbolic or religious, the precision is excessive. If the answer involves actual communication with or orientation towards stellar beings, the precision is appropriate. The ancient Near Eastern traditions outside of Egypt and Sumer add further detail to the picture. The Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian traditions that developed from and alongside the Sumerian provide a historical record of sky-being contact that spans thousands of years. The concept of the Apkallu, 7 fish sages who rose from the sea and taught humanity wisdom and civilization before returning to the deep, appears in Babylonian tradition in a form that many researchers have connected to the Dogon's Nomo and to broader patterns of amphibious or aquatic beings bringing knowledge from beyond. The 7 Apkallu are specifically said to have lived before the Great Flood, to have possessed full wisdom and civilization-giving knowledge, and to have departed and then returned in semi-human form after the flood. The parallel with flood myths from virtually every ancient culture is not coincidental. The flood narrative is among the most universally distributed of all ancient stories, and in almost every version of it, the post-flood civilization is associated with the return or the teaching of beings from outside the ordinary human world. The Vedic flood narrative, the story of Manu and the fish, follows the same pattern. The fish who guides Manu to safety and then reveals cosmic law to him is clearly identified as a divine being in another form, a being of knowledge and purpose operating according to a plan that extends far beyond the immediate circumstances of one man's survival. In the Sumerian version, the flood figure Utnapishtim is warned by the god Enki, an Anunnaki, being specifically described in the text as sympathetic to humanity against the will of other Anunnaki who wished humanity destroyed. In the biblical version, Noah receives warning from God. In every version, a being or beings of non-human knowledge and intent preserve a human seed population for a purpose that is explicitly cosmic in its framing. The continuation of humanity is not merely fortunate, it is intended. The Alpha Centaurian hypothesis regarding the flood traditions is consistent across its major proponents. The claim is that the deluge represented a genuine catastrophic event. Most researchers in this field identify it with the Younger Dryas impact event that appears in the geological record at roughly 12,800 years ago, and which correlates with the sudden cooling, the megafaunal extinction, and the disruption of coastal civilizations that the geological and archaeological record documents, and that the specific knowledge and intervention that preserved human populations through this event involved direct participation by Alpha Centaurian or related beings who had a vested interest in the survival of a human species they had in various ways helped to shape and in whom they had invested, as it were, a considerable amount of cosmic effort. The beings who warned of the flood helped design the survival vessel and provided the seeds of post-catastrophe civilization were, in this reading, not metaphorical divine presences, but actual entities operating with technology and foreknowledge that human beings of that era had no framework to describe except in theological language. This interpretation requires a kind of sympathetic intellectual humility about ancient human beings. They were not stupid. They were not primitive in the way that the word is often condescendingly used. They were as intelligent as we are, with the full human cognitive apparatus, but operating in a knowledge framework that did not include the conceptual vocabulary of modern science. When a person without the concept of an aircraft engine hears or sees an aircraft, they do not describe a jet engine. They describe a roaring, fire-breathing, divine creature that moves through the sky. When a person without the concept of genetic manipulation observes what appears to be systematic biological modification of animals and crops by beings with advanced technology, they do not describe horizontal gene transfer, they describe divine creation. The challenge of reading ancient texts for evidence of extraterrestrial contact is precisely the challenge of translating between two radically different conceptual vocabularies while not letting the translation distort the underlying observations. The written record of the ancient world is vast, and we have only touched its surface here. In the chapters that follow, we will return to specific texts and specific traditions as they become relevant to the developing investigation. But the picture that emerges from this survey is already reasonably clear. Across cultures, across continents, across time periods spanning tens of thousands of years, human beings have documented contact with beings who came from the sky, who possessed knowledge far beyond human capacity, who intervened in human affairs according to a plan that humans did not fully understand, who were associated with specific stellar regions, and who are described in physical terms that match, with remarkable consistency, the profile of beings reported in modern Alpha Centaurian contact accounts. This consistency, across sources that demonstrably could not have coordinated with each other, constitutes the deepest and most fundamental evidence that something real underlies these accounts. The question is not whether contact occurred. The question is who these beings were, what they wanted, and whether their agenda, played out across millennia, is ultimately in humanity's interest, or is something more complicated and more troubling. That question will occupy much of the rest of this documentary, but first we need to bridge the ancient and the modern, to trace the thread of contact through the historical period and into the 20th century, where the documentation becomes denser, the accounts become more detailed, and the official record begins, despite itself, to crack and reveal the outlines of a truth that human civilization has been officially denying since before most people now alive were born. The bridge of centuries. Contact through the historical age. The transition from the ancient world to the historical period does not represent a break in the pattern of contact with beings from beyond. It represents a change in the documentation. As human civilizations became literate, as records became more systematic, as the institutional frameworks of state and church developed their own interests in controlling the narrative of cosmic reality, the record of contact became more fragmented, more coded, more officially suppressed. But it never stopped. The encounters continued. The witnesses continued to report. And the cumulative record of those reports, stretching from the classical world through the medieval period and the age of exploration and into the industrial era, tells a story of sustained, continuous engagement between something not of this world and the human beings who inhabit it. The classical world of Greece and Rome provides a rich source of material. The Greek tradition of divine contact, the gods of Olympus, the Titans, the demigods and heroes, is in many ways a more humanized and narratively developed version of the same pattern we see in Sumer and Egypt. The gods of Greece come from specific locations. Olympus, occasionally the sky itself, possess capabilities far beyond human attainment, interact with select humans in ways that shape history, and are physically described in terms that, once again, match the Alpha Centaurian profile: tall, beautiful, luminous, with an aura of overwhelming presence, and with knowledge that extends far beyond the human. Zeus, Apollo, Athena, Hermes, whatever theological meaning these figures carry, their behavioral descriptions in the original texts are strikingly specific and strikingly physical. They appear to humans in bodily form. They engage in conversations. They provide information, instruction, and occasionally technology. They have personalities, preferences, and apparent emotional responses. The Greek mysteries, the initiation traditions of Eleusis, Samothrace, and Delphi, among others, are particularly significant in this context because they represent a formalized, institutionalized engagement with non-ordinary reality that was maintained across centuries and that involved, according to the accounts of initiates who were permitted to speak about it, direct encounter with beings or presences of non-human nature. The Eleusinian mysteries were the most prestigious and widely participated of these, drawing initiates from across the Greek world for over 2,000 years. The central experience of the initiation, induced by the kykeon, a sacred drink that has been argued to contain psychoactive ergot alkaloids, is described in the accounts of initiates in terms that echo both mystical experience and, in certain accounts, something more physically specific, encounters with beings of light, communications of cosmic knowledge, an overwhelming sense of contact with a reality far larger and more knowing than ordinary human existence. Whether this experience was entirely internal or whether it opened some interface with external non-human consciousness is precisely the question that the mysteries were designed to answer for those who experienced them. The Roman world inherited and adapted the Greek mythological tradition, but it also produced independent records of sky phenomena and divine contact that are worth noting. The Annales Maximi, official Roman state records that were maintained by the Pontifex Maximus, contain detailed accounts of unusual aerial phenomena observed from the earliest period of Roman history, accounts that were taken seriously enough to record in official state documents. Roman historians, including Livy and Pliny the Elder, recorded accounts of shields appearing in the sky, of glowing objects moving in formation, of unusual lights and craft observed over military installations. These accounts were interpreted within the Roman religious framework as divine signs, but their physical descriptions, specific shapes, specific behaviors, specific effects on observers, go considerably beyond what is required for a purely symbolic reading. The medieval period in European history represents a complicated era for contact research. The dominance of the Christian Church and its theological framework for interpreting all unusual experience as either divine miracle or demonic temptation meant that encounters with non-human beings were forced into one of two interpretive boxes, neither of which was adequate to describe what witnesses were actually experiencing. The phenomenon of fairy contact, which throughout the medieval and early modern period in Europe was not regarded as mere folklore, but as genuine encounters with beings from a parallel realm, is particularly significant when examined with modern analytical tools. The physical description of fair folk in their more detailed and less degraded forms, tall, luminous, beautiful, possessed of technology that read as magic, operating according to motivations and timescales that do not map onto human agendas, taking selected humans into their realm for purposes that left those humans changed, matches the Alpha Centaurian contact profile with unsettling precision. Jacques Vallée, the French-American astrophysicist and UFO researcher who has spent decades studying contact phenomena across cultures, was among the first modern investigators to make the systematic connection between the fairy faith of medieval Europe, the angel and demon encounters of religious tradition, the elemental spirits of folk magic, and the modern UFO contact phenomenon. His work, particularly in his landmark books Passport to Magonia and The Invisible College, demonstrated that the behavioral patterns, the reported technologies, the physical descriptions of the beings, and the psychological effects on human witnesses are essentially invariant across these different cultural and historical manifestations. Something is happening, Vallée argued, that is consistent and persistent across time and across interpretive frameworks. The interpretation changes as the cultural context changes. What is an angel in 13th century France becomes a fairy in 15th century Ireland, becomes an alien in 20th century America. But the underlying phenomenon remains the same. Valley's own interpretation of what that underlying phenomenon is remains deliberately agnostic and complex. He does not simply accept the extraterrestrial hypothesis, arguing instead for what he calls the multiverse hypothesis, the idea that these beings may not come from another star, but from another dimension or another level of reality that intersects with ours in ways we do not yet understand. This is a genuine and sophisticated alternative to the Alpha Centaurian hypothesis, and it deserves engagement rather than dismissal. Some researchers in the field have argued for a synthesis, that the Alpha Centaurians do originate in another star system in the physical sense, but that they also possess or routinely use technology that allows movement between dimensional levels, making them effectively both extraterrestrial and extra-dimensional. This would explain certain aspects of contact accounts that pure spaceship from another star interpretations have difficulty with, particularly the ability to appear and disappear instantaneously, to pass through solid matter, and to engage with human consciousness in ways that go far beyond what mere physical proximity would suggest. The Middle Ages also produced a specific category of contact account that is often overlooked in mainstream discussions: the fairy abduction narratives. These stories, which are distributed across Irish, Scottish, Welsh, Scandinavian, and various continental European folk traditions, describe the taking of humans, usually young, physically attractive, talented, or otherwise notable individuals, by beings from a parallel realm, for purposes that are always somewhat obscure, but that consistently involve some kind of biological, reproductive, or transformative agenda. The parallels with modern alien abduction accounts are not subtle. They include the selection of specific individuals based on characteristics that seem to track across generations, the experience of time distortion, days or years passing in what seemed like hours, or vice versa, the performance of what reads as medical examination and biological sampling, the return of the individual to the human world changed in ways that may include unusual knowledge, unusual perceptual sensitivity, or health effects that are difficult to explain medically. And they include, in a significant number of accounts, a reproductive or hybrid generation element, the claim that the fairy beings were interested in or engaged in the production of hybrid offspring combining fairy and human characteristics. The genetic and reproductive element of alleged Alpha Centaurian interaction with humanity is one of the most contested, most disturbing, and in many ways most important threads in this entire investigation. It will be addressed at length in a later part of this documentary, drawing on both the ancient mythological traditions and the modern abduction literature and the interpretive frameworks that various researchers have applied to them. For now, we note simply that this element is not new. It is as old as human recorded contact with non-human beings, distributed across cultures and historical periods with the same kind of consistency that marks every other aspect of the phenomenon. The Renaissance and early modern period saw the re-emergence of classical learning in Europe, including the classical traditions of contact with divine or celestial beings, filtered through Christian theological frameworks, but often pushing against those frameworks in directions that were deemed heretical by church authority. The Hermetic tradition, based on texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a legendary figure described as the embodiment of both the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth, and representing a synthesis of Greek, Egyptian, and Neoplatonic mystical philosophy, is directly relevant to our investigation. The Hermetic texts describe a cosmos populated by intelligences of various orders, some of them planetary and stellar in nature, who interact with human consciousness through means that Hermetic practitioners sought to understand and exploit through magical practice. The Hermetic Magi of the Renaissance, Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, Giordano Bruno, were not merely philosophers. They were attempting, within the conceptual vocabulary available to them, to systematize and operationalize what they understood as genuine engagement with non-human intelligences whose nature, origin, and agenda they were doing their utmost to comprehend. Giordano Bruno is particularly interesting in this context. Bruno was burned at the stake by the Roman Inquisition in 1600, and his burning is often cited as a martyrdom for the heliocentric model of the solar system. But Bruno's actual intellectual crimes went considerably beyond heliocentrism. He argued for the plurality of worlds, the existence of many inhabited planets orbiting many suns, in terms that went far beyond what Copernican astronomy required or even suggested. He described the universe as infinite and as filled with beings of various kinds, some of them far more advanced than humanity. He claimed that the beings described in Hermetic tradition were real intelligences with which human consciousness could genuinely engage. And he implied, in certain of his writings, that this knowledge came not from purely philosophical reasoning, but from actual contact, that he had personally experienced communication with non-human intelligences that had communicated specific information to him about the nature of the cosmos. The Inquisition burned him for 8 specific heretical propositions, the full list of which has never been published, which has led some researchers to suspect that the specific content of his cosmological claims went even further than what appears in his published work. The 17th and 18th centuries saw the beginnings of what would eventually become the scientific revolution, a systematic attempt to describe the natural world in terms of universal physical law, without reference to divine intervention or non-human agency. This was, in many respects, a liberation. The scientific method provided a more reliable path to certain kinds of knowledge than theological authority had, but it also had a consequence for the study of contact phenomena that has shaped everything since. By establishing the natural world as the only proper domain of serious inquiry, and by defining the natural world as one in which only material causes of material effects are admissible, the scientific framework made itself structurally incapable of addressing the contact phenomenon, even if it manifested with perfect clarity and reproducibility. If a non-human being of extraordinary capability appears in a room and demonstrates technology that violates known physics, the honest scientific response would be to document the observation carefully and revise the framework to accommodate it. The institutional response of modern science has instead been to deny the observation, ridicule the witness, and defend the framework. This is not unique to science. It is the behavior of any powerful institution that perceives a genuine existential threat, and the contact phenomenon is precisely that. An existential threat to the current institutional framework of human knowledge and power, not because it is necessarily malevolent, but because its reality would require the entire structure of human knowledge and governance to be comprehensively rebuilt from foundations that are, at the moment, officially denied. The 19th century, with its explosion of spiritualist and theosophical movements, brought the contact phenomenon back to more explicit surface-level expression. The Theosophical Society, founded by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky in 1875, was remarkable in many respects, but most directly relevant to our investigation is Blavatsky's claim that the cosmological and anthropological information in her 2 major works, Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine, came not from ordinary human research, but from communication with beings she called the Masters, or the Mahatmas. These beings, in Blavatsky's accounts, were not the deceased spirits of ordinary humans, but highly advanced beings who had transcended the ordinary human cycle and existed at a level of consciousness and knowledge far above the ordinary. They communicated with her through a combination of mental transmission and physical phenomenon, letters that appeared in sealed locations, information about stellar and cosmic matters that was independently verifiable in ways that standard academic research could not have produced, and direct experiential transmissions of cosmological frameworks that Blavatsky then translated, imperfectly by her own admission, into her massive literary output. The Mahatma letters, a collection of letters allegedly transmitted paranormally by these masters to 2 early theosophists, A.P. Sinnett and A.O. Hume, were carefully preserved and are still available for examination. Their content includes discussions of the nature of the cosmos, the structure of consciousness, the history of the Earth and of humanity, and the role of advanced intelligences in guiding human evolution that are, in many specific details, consistent with what later Alpha Centaurian contact accounts describe. The masters described in the Mahatma letters are not identified as extraterrestrial in the modern sense of the word. The concept was not yet available in that form. but they are described as beings who exist outside the ordinary constraints of physical human existence, who possess knowledge of cosmic cycles and stellar geography that goes far beyond anything human science of the 19th century had access to, and who regard the development of human consciousness as a project in which they have a direct and long-term stake. Whether Blavatsky was genuinely in contact with advanced non-human intelligences, or whether she was an extraordinarily creative syncretist and scholar who constructed an elaborate cosmological system from available sources, plus her own considerable imagination, is a question that has been debated since her own lifetime. The honest answer is that the evidence points toward genuine anomalous phenomena associated with her that cannot be fully explained by the fraud hypothesis, while also suggesting that her ability to accurately transmit what she received was imperfect, and that later theosophical developments amplified and distorted the original transmission in significant ways. What is most important for our purposes is that the late 19th century, the same era that produced Darwin's theory of evolution, Maxwell's electrodynamics, and the beginnings of modern physics, also produced the most systematic attempt since the Renaissance to describe and document communication with advanced non-human intelligences, and that this attempt, whatever its specific reliability as a transmission, encoded a cosmological framework that will recur throughout the rest of our investigation. The early 20th century saw several important developments that bridge the historical and the modern periods. The first wave of what we would now call channeled communication, contact with beings that identified themselves as coming from specific star systems and communicating specific information about cosmic reality, began in the early part of the century with figures like Alice Bailey, whose material attributed to a being she called the Tibetan, or Jewel-Kul, describes a cosmic hierarchy and a plan for human evolution that, in specific structural details, matches the Alpha Centaurian contact framework as it later developed. Rudolf Steiner, whose anthroposophical cosmology was derived from what he claimed were direct spiritual perceptions of the Akashic record, the cosmic memory of all events, described a hierarchy of spiritual beings engaged in guiding human evolution that similarly maps onto the framework of extraterrestrial civilizations involved with Earth, once one translates between his spiritual scientific vocabulary and the more physical vocabulary of modern UFO research. We are, by now, building toward the moment when all of these threads, ancient mythological, historical religious, 19th century spiritualist, and theosophical, early 20th century channeled, converge with the hard physical evidence of the modern UFO era and the testimony of government insiders and experiencers. That convergence does not simplify anything, but it makes the scope of what we are dealing with unmistakable. This is not a modern phenomenon. It is not an American phenomenon. It is not a product of 1950s science fiction bleeding into mass psychology. It is something that has been happening on and around this planet for an immeasurably long period of time, and the modern era has not created it. The modern era has merely given us new tools, technological, psychological, sociological, with which to try to understand it. The World War era and its immediate aftermath, which we will explore in depth in the next section, represents not a beginning, but an intensification and a renegotiation. The stakes changed, the technology changed, and the response of human institutions to the reality of extraterrestrial contact changed in ways whose consequences we are still living inside of today. The modern disclosure, Roswell, contactees, and the intelligence response. The year 1947 arrived not as a point of alien novelty, but as a threshold event in a much longer drama. The skies over the United States, over Europe, over the Pacific and the Soviet Union had been active with anomalous aerial phenomena for years before the now famous summer of that year. British Royal Air Force pilots had documented encounters with so-called Foo Fighters during the final years of World War II. Small, luminous, apparently controlled spheres that paced Allied aircraft matched their maneuvers with impossible agility and then vanished without engaging hostilely. German and Japanese pilots reported the same phenomena from their side of the conflict, ruling out any hypothesis that these objects belonged to any combatant nation. The phenomenon was documented in official military records on both sides of the war and then officially classified and denied. In 1946, a massive wave of so-called ghost rockets was observed over Scandinavia and Northern Europe. Elongated, metallic-appearing objects that flew trajectories and at speeds inconsistent with any known military or civilian aircraft of the period. The Swedish, Finnish, and Norwegian militaries investigated seriously. The Swedish Defense Staff concluded in an official report that a large portion of the observed objects were real physical phenomena that could not be explained by conventional means. The American and British militaries were informed. The information was classified. The summer of 1947 produced 3 events of overwhelming subsequent importance. In late June, private pilot Kenneth Arnold observed 9 unusually shaped aircraft flying at extraordinary speed near Mount Rainier in Washington state, describing their movement as similar to a saucer skipping across water, generating the term flying saucer that would define the era. Within 2 weeks, a craft of some kind crashed near Roswell, New Mexico, on the property of rancher Mac Brazel. And across the same period, hundreds of separate civilian sightings of anomalous aerial objects were reported across the continental United States, representing a wave of activity that the newly established U.S. Army Air Forces was wholly unprepared to explain or contain. The Roswell incident has been dissected, analyzed, claimed, counterclaimed, and weaponized by every faction in the ongoing argument about the reality of extraterrestrial contact. We are not going to rehash every detail of that story here. What matters for our purposes are specific aspects of the Roswell event that connect directly to the question of Alpha Centaurian identity and presence. The most important of these concerns the reported descriptions of the non-human bodies recovered at the crash site, because those descriptions, when they have been detailed enough to go beyond mere generalization, present a problem for those who argue that the bodies were of a species unrelated to the tall, fair, humanoid type associated with Alpha Centaurian contact. The most authoritative early Roswell sources, Brigadier General Arthur Exon, who flew over the Roswell debris field and later commanded Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where recovered materials were reportedly stored, Colonel Jesse Marcel Sr., who handled the debris directly, Mortician Glenn Dennis, who reported receiving unusual calls about non-human bodies from Roswell Army Airfield, and Nurse Naomi Self, whose account Dennis relayed, describe bodies that are approximately 4 to 5 feet tall, thin, with large heads and large eyes, gray or grayish-white in skin color. This is the small gray type that has dominated alien iconography ever since, and these are clearly not what most researchers describe as Alpha Centaurians, who are reported as tall, human-appearing, and Nordic in physical type. The Roswell case, in the Alpha Centaurian research framework, is therefore not primarily a story about Alpha Centaurians. It is a story about a different category of being, the small grays, who represent either a separate extraterrestrial species or, in the hypothesis advanced by certain researchers and alleged government insiders, biological constructs or clones created and operated by the Alpha Centaurians or by a competing extraterrestrial group. The relationship between the tall whites and the small grays is one of the most complex and contested areas in the entire field, and it will be examined in depth when we address the question of multiple extraterrestrial groups and their respective relationships with humanity. What the Roswell event did, regardless of the specific nature of the beings and craft involved, was trigger the creation of the permanent, classified, deeply secret, institutional infrastructure within the United States government and military that would deal with the extraterrestrial question from that point forward. The exact architecture of this infrastructure, whether it was the Majestic 12 Committee described in documents that surfaced in the 1980s, or some different organizational structure, remains contested. What is not contested is that such infrastructure exists because multiple whistleblowers from different agencies, different time periods, and different levels of access have independently described its existence, its activities, and its conclusions in terms that are broadly consistent with each other, and that have been partially confirmed by declassified documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests. The modern contactee movement, which emerged in the early 1950s as a distinct and highly visible social phenomenon, is directly relevant to the Alpha Centaurian question, because several of the most prominent contactees specifically identified their contacts as coming from Venus, Mars, or, in a small number of cases, from the Alpha Centauri system. The most famous early contactees, George Adamski, George Van Tassel, Truman Bethurum, Orfeo Angelucci, Daniel Fry, and others, reported encounters with beings who were physically humanoid, tall or normal human height, fair-featured, and who communicated messages that combined scientific claims with spiritual or philosophical content. The scientific claims, for the most part, have not held up. The beings who allegedly told George Adamski about inhabiting Venus were describing a planet that has since been shown to have surface temperatures that would incinerate any life as we understand it. This factual failure has been used to dismiss the entire contactee tradition, which is epistemically hasty. The philosophical and spiritual content of the contactee messages, the warnings about nuclear weapons, the emphasis on human consciousness development, the description of a larger cosmic community of civilizations, represents a strikingly consistent theme that requires engagement separate from the question of whether any specific physical claim is accurate. George Van Tassel is particularly worth examining. Van Tassel was a former aeronautical engineer who had worked for Hughes Aircraft and had extensive technical knowledge. He claimed to have been in contact from 1952 onward with beings who identified themselves as from the Council of Seven Lights and who provided technical information about time and consciousness technology that Van Tassel spent the last 25 years of his life attempting to build in the form of a structure he called the Integratron, located in Landers, California. The Integratron, a large domed structure built from wood and other non-metallic materials, according to specifications Van Tassel claimed were provided by the beings, was never completed before his death in 1978, and the full claimed capabilities of the device were never demonstrated. But the technical sophistication of the underlying theory, involving scalar electromagnetics, Tesla coils, and the relationship between biological aging and electrical charge, goes considerably beyond what would be expected from an ordinary aerospace industry professional fabricating a contactee story. Van Tassel also organized the Giant Rock spacecraft conventions from 1953 to 1978, which drew thousands of attendees at their peak and served as a forum for the exchange of contactee testimony and related research in a period when such exchange had no other institutional vehicle. The beings Van Tassel described, and this is consistent with many other contactees of the period, were not described in the language of space aliens, but in something closer to the language of the Vedic and theosophical traditions, as beings of advanced consciousness who existed at a higher level of spiritual and technological development, who regarded human beings as younger members of a cosmic family, and whose primary concern was with the spiritual and evolutionary trajectory of humanity, rather than with any specifically physical or resource-based agenda. This framing, the cosmic family, the evolutionary assistance, the concern about humanity's direction, is one of the most consistent elements of Alpha Centaurian contact reports across the entire range of sources. The intelligence community's response to the early contactee movement was systematic and largely effective at containing the public discourse. Documents released through FOIA requests confirm that the FBI, the CIA, and military intelligence agencies all monitored the major contactee figures closely. George Adamski was under FBI surveillance. Van Tassel's Giant Rock conventions were attended by intelligence operatives. The strategy that emerged was not primarily suppressive. It did not involve mass arrests or official denials of the contactees' right to speak. It involved three main tactics: ridicule, which was cultivated through deliberate disinformation campaigns and media management; infiltration, through which intelligence assets were placed within the contactee and UFO research communities to steer discussion in unproductive directions; and the selective management of evidence, particularly physical evidence, through a program of retrieval and classification that ensured that the most compelling material never reached public or independent scientific scrutiny. The Robertson Panel of 1953, a CIA-sponsored scientific review of the UFO phenomenon that was convened in the immediate aftermath of a wave of sightings over Washington, D.C. that alarmed military planners, produced recommendations that shaped U.S. government management of the UFO issue for decades. The panel concluded, in a document that remained classified until 1974, that the immediate hazard of UFOs to national security was low, but that the public interest in UFOs represented a threat to the normal functioning of military intelligence communications. It recommended a program of public debunking, of stripping the subject of its special status, and of monitoring civilian UFO research organizations. This is exactly what was implemented. The Blue Book Project, the official Air Force investigation of UFO reports, was publicly presented as a serious scientific investigation, but was internally structured as a public relations exercise, with a mission to reassure the public rather than to actually investigate. The serious investigation happened elsewhere, in programs that did not have public faces and whose existence remained classified for decades. Project Sign, which preceded Blue Book and which included serious researchers, had produced an estimate in 1948, the so-called Estimate of the Situation, concluding that a significant portion of observed unidentified aerial phenomena were of extraterrestrial origin. This estimate was rejected by Air Force Chief of Staff Hoyt Vandenberg, who ordered it destroyed. Most copies were destroyed, not all. The existence of this document and its conclusion is known from the testimony of Edward Ruppelt, who ran Project Blue Book from 1951 to 1953, and who described it in his 1956 book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. The institutional pattern is clear. When the honest investigation produced conclusions that the institutional framework could not accommodate, the conclusions were classified or destroyed. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the research outside official channels was developing rapidly. The establishment of NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, under the leadership of former Naval Intelligence Officer Donald Keyhoe, provided an organizational vehicle for serious civilian UFO research. Keyhoe, who had authored several books arguing strongly that UFOs were of extraterrestrial origin and that the U.S. government knew this and was covering it up, was relentless in pursuing official documents and congressional testimony. His efforts contributed to the 1966 Ford-sponsored congressional hearings on UFOs, and to the subsequent commissioning of the Condon Committee study at the University of Colorado, which produced in 1969 the Condon Report, widely regarded within the research community as a predetermined whitewash that reached its debunking conclusions despite a body of case material that its own investigators regarded as genuinely unexplained at a significant rate. Edward Condon himself, the physicist who led the study, was privately contemptuous of the subject from the beginning and had determined the public conclusion before the investigation began. This was documented by one of his own committee members, astronomer David Saunders, who was fired from the project when he raised concerns about Condon's methodology and bias. Saunders subsequently published his own account of the committee's proceedings, UFOs? Yes, which documented the internal dysfunction. The Condon Report's conclusion, that further study of UFOs was unwarranted and that no evidence existed of extraterrestrial spacecraft, was accepted by the Air Force as justification for closing Project Blue Book in 1969. The serious classified investigation continued in other forms. It was during the 1960s and into the 1970s that the specific category of Alpha Centaurian contact began to be more sharply distinguished in the research literature from other categories of alleged extraterrestrial contact. The development of abduction research, beginning with Betty and Barney Hill's 1961 encounter, which produced Under Hypnosis, a remarkably detailed and internally consistent account of being taken aboard a craft by beings who performed physical examinations, brought new methodological tools and new categories of testimony to the field. The Hill case is famous above all for the star map that Betty Hill drew under hypnosis, depicting a pattern of stars, including a sun-like star connected by lines she understood to represent trade routes and less important routes, which Ohio schoolteacher Marjorie Fish subsequently identified in 1968 as matching the star pattern of the local neighborhood of stars, including Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2. This identification made headlines and was extensively analyzed by astronomers. The beings in the Hill case were small grays, not the tall humanoid Alpha Centaurian type. But the methodology developed through the Hill investigation would later be applied to a different category of abduction accounts, producing a strikingly different set of testimony that speaks directly to the Alpha Centaurian question. The 1970s produced the bulk of what is now known as the contactee testimony tradition, separate from the abduction tradition in important ways, though overlapping with it in some accounts. Several figures who claimed sustained contact with tall, fair humanoid beings during this period have provided testimony that is, when analyzed carefully, more internally consistent and more technically sophisticated than the popular impression of the contactee tradition would suggest. Edward Billy Meyer of Switzerland is the most famous and most controversial of these. Meyer claimed, and has continued to claim for over 50 years, sustained contact with beings he identifies as Plejaren, who originate from a star system he locates in the Pleiades cluster, but who are described in terms that closely parallel Alpha Centaurian descriptions in other accounts. Extremely tall, fair-featured, blue-eyed beings of extraordinary intelligence and spiritual development, who regard humanity with a combination of concern and frustration, and who have provided Meyer with information about cosmic history, the structure of consciousness, and the long-term trajectory of human civilization. Meyer's case has generated an extraordinary amount of analysis, both supporting and critical. The photographic and physical evidence he has produced, extensive photographic documentation of craft, metal samples, crystal samples, and sound recordings, has been subjected to repeated expert analysis, with results that have divided analysts sharply. Some of the photographs have been credibly demonstrated as fabrications. Others, particularly the earlier ones, have withstood repeated forensic analysis and have been pronounced authentic by investigators including aerospace engineers and film analysts who were initially skeptical. The situation is one that resists simple resolution, which is itself instructive. It suggests either an enormously sophisticated and sustained fraud by a one-armed farmer with no obvious financial motive, or a genuine contact case contaminated over the years by deliberate disinformation and by Meyer's own embellishments and errors. What is most interesting for our purposes in the Meyer case is not the physical evidence, but the content of the alleged communications. The Meyer contact notes, which run to thousands of pages of alleged transcribed conversations with Semjase and other Plejaren beings. Whatever their ultimate source, these notes contain a cosmological framework, a description of the history of the interaction between Earth and off-world civilizations, and an account of the structure and agenda of these beings that is, across its thousands of pages and over its decades of production, more internally consistent than would be expected from a continuous fabrication. Specific claims made in the contact notes about specific physical characteristics of the Jovian moons, about the existence of planets around certain star systems, about specific astronomical phenomena that were either unknown or unconfirmed at the time of the alleged contacts, have subsequently been confirmed by independent scientific investigation. This does not prove the contacts are genuine, but it is difficult to dismiss. The contactee and abduction literature of the 1970s and 1980s builds toward a picture of multiple categories of extraterrestrial involvement with Earth, involving at minimum the small grays, the tall humanoid beings of the Alpha Centaurian or Nordic type, and several other described varieties. The relationship between these groups, whether they represent separate civilizations with different agendas, different functional roles within a single operational hierarchy, or something even more complex, is one of the central puzzles of the field. And it is a puzzle whose solution, insofar as any solution has been proposed, points toward a picture of Earth as the arena of a complex and not always cooperative multi-party engagement that human beings have been largely unaware of, and that the governments and institutions of the world have known about in varying degrees of detail for at least 70 years. The 1980s brought two developments of particular importance. The first was the publication of Bud Hopkins's Missing Time in 1981 and Whitley Strieber's Communion in 1987, which brought the abduction phenomenon to mass public awareness in ways that permanently changed the cultural landscape of the UFO subject. The second was the emergence of the first generation of credible government and military insiders who began to speak carefully and with obvious concern about the personal and professional risk they were taking, about what they had directly witnessed or been briefed on during their service in classified programs. These insiders, figures like Sergeant Clifford Stone, Captain Robert Collins, Robert Dean, and numerous others who spoke to researchers like Timothy Good, Linda Moulton Howe, and Stanton Friedman, described with varying levels of specificity and varying degrees of corroboration, a picture of governmental knowledge about extraterrestrial presence that went far beyond what the official public position admitted. Among the most specific of these early insider accounts is the one associated with Robert Dean, a command sergeant major who served at NATO's Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, and who claimed to have read in 1964 a classified NATO study called The Assessment, which had concluded that Earth was being visited by 4 distinct categories of extraterrestrial beings, at least one of which was so physically similar to human beings that individual members of this group had reportedly walked through secured military installations without being identified as non-human until they were carefully examined. This is a description that maps precisely onto the Alpha Centaurian profile. Tall, fair, humanoid beings so similar in appearance to human beings that casual observation does not distinguish them. The fact that Robert Dean described this in terms of a classified NATO document from 1964, decades before the Alpha Centaurian hypothesis had been developed in the public research literature, gives his account a specific evidentiary weight that distinguishes it from accounts that merely reproduce culturally available narratives. The 1990s saw the acceleration and deepening of this insider testimony tradition, building toward the more public disclosure efforts of the 21st century. But before we get there, we need to address what may be the most important and least discussed aspect of the Alpha Centaurian presence in the modern era: the alleged working relationship, or at least the sustained engagement, between Alpha Centaurian beings and selected human beings in positions of political, scientific, and military authority, because the testimony that has emerged from multiple independent sources converges on a disturbing possibility that the contact between Alpha Centaurian beings and human civilization in the modern era has not been merely a matter of occasional sightings and abduction experiences. It has involved, at some level, direct communication, exchange, and negotiation between these beings and the most powerful governmental entities on Earth. And that engagement, according to the testimony, has been profoundly unequal, has involved exchanges whose terms humanity did not fully understand, and has had consequences that are still playing out. Nordic beings and the secret agreements. The concept of formal agreements between human governments and extraterrestrial entities is, from the perspective of official institutional reality, preposterous. It belongs in the category of things that simply could not be true because the world does not work that way. But the testimony in support of this concept, the number of independent, credible, high-access insiders who have described in consistent terms a process of formal or semi-formal contact, negotiation, and agreement between the United States government and at minimum one category of extraterrestrial beings is too substantial and too detailed to dismiss without examining. The foundational document in this territory is the so-called Majestic 12 or MJ-12 briefing papers, a collection of documents that surfaced in the early 1980s, sent to UFO researchers Jaime Shandera and William Moore in the form of undeveloped film. These documents, when analyzed, purport to describe the creation of a classified oversight committee established by President Harry Truman in September 1947 to manage the extraterrestrial contact situation in the aftermath of the Roswell recovery. The 12 members of this committee, which included some of the most powerful figures in American military, scientific, and intelligence circles of the late 1940s, were tasked with total secrecy, unlimited funding, and the full management of what the documents describe as the most important and most sensitive issue in human history. The MJ-12 documents have been extensively analyzed, contested, and argued about for 4 decades. The FBI investigated them, concluded they were probably fabricated, and then, when pressed, admitted that it could not definitively establish that they were fabricated. The typography, the document formats, the signatures, and the historical references have been analyzed by multiple independent investigators with contradictory results. Some specific details in the documents are historically accurate in ways that would have been very difficult to fabricate. Other details are inconsistent with known historical records. The current consensus among serious researchers is that the original MJ-12 documents may include both genuine leaked material and deliberate disinformation, and that the subsequent flood of additional MJ-12 documents that appeared in later years were largely fabricated, possibly with the specific purpose of contaminating and discrediting the original material. The distinction between Alpha Centaurian and Gray-type involvement in the alleged government agreements is crucial and is where the testimony becomes most complex. The accounts that have been most thoroughly documented and most consistently reported describe a situation in which the United States government had different types of contact at different times with different categories of non-human entities, and that these contacts involved strikingly different terms and different agendas on the part of the non-human participants. The contact with tall, fair, humanoid beings, the type consistently associated in research literature with Alpha Centaurian origin, is described in multiple independent accounts as occurring in the late 1940s and early 1950s, predating the more notorious agreements attributed to the Eisenhower administration in the mid-1950s. Contactee George Adamski's account of meeting with fair-haired, human-appearing beings is the most publicly known version of this type of encounter. But Adamski is widely regarded as a problematic source, and the more significant accounts come from other categories of witness. The most compelling account of early U.S. governmental contact with the tall humanoid type comes from multiple independent sources, all of whom converge on a set of alleged contact events at Muroc Army Airfield, later Edwards Air Force Base, in California in February and March of 1954, during which President Dwight D. Eisenhower allegedly met with representatives of a group that, in various accounts, is described as fair-skinned, tall, and Nordic in appearance, who were offering the United States a proposal for a form of cooperation that involved arms reduction and an end to nuclear weapons development in exchange for a form of technological exchange and open acknowledgement of their presence. The Eisenhower-Muroc meetings are described in accounts from a variety of sources, including former intelligence officers, alleged participants, and witnesses to peripheral events associated with the meetings. The president's January 1954 Palm Springs vacation, during which he briefly disappeared from his official schedule and was initially reported dead by a wire service, provides a potential historical anchor for these accounts. The White House's official explanation that Eisenhower had been to an emergency dental appointment was accepted at the time, but has since been questioned by researchers who have noted that the dentist reportedly visited did not routinely treat the president. Charles L. Suggs, former Master Sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps, provided testimony describing his father, then Lieutenant Colonel Suggs, who was stationed at Muroc, witnessing 2 craft land at the base and beings described as human-appearing, with fair skin, blue eyes, and blonde hair, emerged and met with military and government personnel. The beings in this and related accounts are described as making a specific proposal, that they would share technology and would help humanity develop in ways that would be beneficial, but that the condition was mutual nuclear disarmament and transparency about their presence. The United States government, in these accounts, declined this proposal, primarily because the technology transfer was not specific enough and because the condition of nuclear transparency was regarded as strategically impossible to accept in the Cold War environment. This reported rejection is described in subsequent accounts as the pivotal decision point in 20th century human extraterrestrial relations. The Alpha Centaurian beings, or beings of this type, having offered cooperation and been refused, are described as withdrawing to a less direct mode of engagement, continuing to monitor and occasionally intervene in ways they regarded as necessary, but no longer pursuing formal relationship with human governments that had demonstrated they were unwilling to meet the fundamental conditions. The subsequent Eisenhower administration meeting at Holloman Air Force Base in 1955 described in a different set of accounts, most notably the testimony of Gerald Light, a metaphysical researcher who claimed to have been present, and subsequently echoed by accounts attributed to various military and intelligence insiders, involved a different group entirely. This second group, in the accounts, is described as the beings associated with the small gray type, and is not identified with Alpha Centauri, but with the Zeta Reticuli system in the accounts that identify a stellar origin. The agreements allegedly reached with this second group involved a very different set of terms. The United States government would receive specific technologies, in particular advanced weapons and propulsion technology, and in exchange the beings would be permitted to conduct limited biological testing and research on human subjects, with the condition that the subjects would be returned unharmed, that the full list of abductees would be provided to the government, and that the activity would be kept secret. The problem with these accounts, as they have developed in the research literature, is that the conditions were allegedly violated, that the beings did not keep to the agreed limitations, did not consistently return subjects unharmed, did not provide full lists of abductees, and did not disclose the full extent of their activities. The claim that the U.S. government entered into an agreement with one extraterrestrial group and was subsequently deceived by that group has been described as the worst foreign policy mistake in human history by researchers who take it seriously and as pure science fiction by those who do not. What is striking about this narrative, whatever its specific accuracy, is how well it explains certain aspects of the UFO cover-up that are otherwise puzzling. Why? If the government simply did not know what UFOs were, would the cover-up be so intense, so sustained, so multi-layered, and so specifically targeted at preventing scientific investigation? The answer that the government did not know what UFOs were requires the cover-up to be purely reactive and defensive, an attempt to prevent public panic in the absence of knowledge. The answer that the government entered into agreements with extraterrestrial groups that subsequently violated those agreements requires the cover-up to be a matter of the most extreme national and perhaps civilizational security, an attempt to prevent the revelation of something so appalling and so beyond any government's ability to manage that disclosure would represent a complete collapse of institutional authority. The specific role of Alpha Centaurian beings in this period and in the alleged agreement framework is described in several accounts as that of a third party, neither the human governments nor the agreeing Greys, but an observing and occasionally intervening presence that is deeply concerned about the terms and consequences of the human Grey agreements, and that represents, in various accounts, a more genuinely benevolent interest in human welfare. This tripartite structure, human governments, the Greys or their representatives, and the Nordic or Alpha Centaurian beings, becomes the organizing framework for much of the advanced contactee and insider testimony from the 1960s onward. Captain Bill Robertson, an alleged former intelligence operative who went by the name Captain Bill and who founded an alternative spiritual movement in the 1980s, described in documents that were publicly available before his death a briefing from the late 1970s in which the three-way structure was outlined in considerable detail. Robertson's accounts are not straightforward source material. He had his own ideological and institutional frameworks that shape how he presented the information. But the underlying structural description, stripped of its ideological framing, is consistent with what emerges from independent sources. More directly credible is the testimony of Phil Schneider, a former government geological engineer who claimed to have worked on the construction of deep underground military bases and who described, before his death in 1996, in circumstances that many researchers consider suspicious, direct encounters with extraterrestrial beings in underground facilities. Schneider's testimony about the Dulce Base incident of 1979, in which he claimed an armed confrontation between U.S. military personnel and large gray beings in an underground facility in New Mexico, resulted in casualties on both sides, is the most dramatic of his claims and the one most difficult to evaluate. But his broader descriptions of the extraterrestrial situation, as understood in classified government circles, describe the same tripartite structure. Multiple groups of extraterrestrials operating in different ways and with different agendas, the human government's compromised relationship with the most dangerous of these groups, and the existence of a separate group of beings who are described as more positively oriented toward humanity, but who operate under constraints that limit their direct intervention. The consistent appearance of this constraint theme in Alpha Centaurian accounts is worth pausing on, across a wide range of independent sources, from the historical mythological traditions with their accounts of divine beings who could not simply override human choice, but had to work through consent and invitation, to the modern contactee accounts in which the Nordic beings repeatedly describe themselves as limited in how directly they can intervene in human affairs. There is a pattern of limitation that is too consistent to be coincidental. The beings want to help, or at minimum want to prevent certain catastrophic outcomes, but they operate under rules or agreements or cosmic laws that prevent them from simply solving human problems by force. They have to work through human cooperation, through human consciousness development, through the gradual elevation of human awareness to a level that makes different choices possible. This is a profoundly different picture from the one implied by the gray-based abduction scenario, in which the beings take what they want, regardless of human consent, and operate on an agenda that is primarily self-interested. The contrast between the reported behavioral ethics of the Nordic or Alpha Centaurian type and the reported behavioral ethics of the gray type is one of the most fundamental dividing lines in the extraterrestrial research literature. Whether this contrast reflects two genuinely different civilizations with genuinely different moral frameworks, or whether it reflects a more complex operational structure in which beings of different apparent types serve different functions within a single larger system, is a question that the evidence does not yet definitively resolve. We will return to this question repeatedly. But first, we need to examine the specific content of what Alpha Centaurian beings have reportedly communicated to human contactees and to government insiders about their identity, their history, their relationship to Earth, and their agenda. Because the content of these communications, when examined systematically and compared across independent sources, reveals a picture of extraordinary depth and complexity. A picture of a civilization that has been involved with Earth for a period measured not in centuries, but in hundreds of thousands of years, that regards human beings with a mixture of care, frustration, and long-term hope, and that is engaged in an effort whose scope makes everything that human history considers important look, by comparison, very small. The message, what they say they want. Across the full spectrum of Alpha Centaurian contact accounts, from the earliest historical traditions to the most recent credible reports, there is a body of communicated content that is sufficiently consistent to constitute what researchers have begun to call the Alpha Centaurian message. This is not a single document or a single communication event. It is a cumulative body of statements, teachings, warnings, and descriptions that has been assembled from hundreds of independent sources over decades, and that displays a degree of internal coherence that cannot easily be attributed to cultural contamination or to the mutual influence of sources that were, in many cases, demonstrably isolated from each other. The message has several major themes that recur across virtually all sources: the nature and history of the cosmos, the specific history of life on Earth and the role of off-world civilizations in shaping it, the dangers of current human technological development, particularly nuclear weapons and related technologies, the possibility and importance of a different trajectory for human civilization, and the nature and implications of a larger cosmic community of which humanity is an unrecognized member. These themes are not independent, but deeply interconnected, and the picture they paint together is one that challenges almost every assumption that modern human civilization has made about its own nature, origin, and significance. On the question of cosmic history, Alpha Centaurian communications consistently describe a universe that is ancient, organized, and inhabited to a degree that makes human estimates of the probability of intelligent life elsewhere look absurdly conservative. The universe is described not as a random collection of matter organized by impersonal physical law, but as a structured reality in which consciousness plays a constitutive role, in which the physical universe, as perceived by ordinary human senses, is a partial and somewhat misleading representation of a larger reality in which consciousness, energy, and matter are more continuously intertwined than modern physics has yet established. The beings describe this not as religious metaphor, but as scientific fact, as something they know from direct investigation and experience conducted over billions of years of civilizational development in the same empirical spirit that human science investigates the world. The history of life in the galaxy, as described in these communications, is one in which intelligence has arisen repeatedly in many locations and has followed developmental trajectories that vary enormously in their timeline and their outcomes, but that tend to pass through recognizable stages. Among these stages is the one humanity is currently in, a period of significant technological capability combined with insufficient wisdom and consciousness development to deploy that capability safely. The dangers of this stage are not merely local. A civilization that destroys itself at this stage does not simply fail to develop further, but may in the process damage the larger cosmic fabric in ways that affect other civilizations. This is the specific reason in the Alpha Centaurian framework why advanced civilizations take an interest in younger ones at this juncture, not from philanthropy exactly, but from a recognition that the failure modes of immature technological civilizations are a collective problem for the galactic community. The nuclear weapons issue is, in this framework, the clearest current example of this dynamic. The detonation of nuclear weapons does not merely create local physical damage in this account. It creates disturbances in the structure of space-time and in the subtle dimensional fabric that all civilizations in this region of the galaxy inhabit. The specific concern about nuclear testing, which appears in Alpha Centaurian contact accounts from the earliest period of the nuclear era with remarkable consistency, is not described as an aesthetic objection or even primarily as a concern for human health and environment, though those concerns are present. It is described as a concern about dimensional and spatial effects that human physics has not yet detected, but that a more advanced physics does describe and measure. Several contactees report being shown, in their interactions with Nordic beings, visual representations of what their contacts describe as the damage pattern created by nuclear detonations in dimensions beyond the physical. A kind of three-dimensional map of harm that extends far beyond the immediate blast radius in ways that human instruments do not detect. This claim is difficult to evaluate independently, but it is consistent across sources, and it provides a rational motive for the extraordinary level of Alpha Centaurian documented interest in human nuclear activity, an interest that goes back to the first detonations, and that has been expressed not merely through communications to contactees, but through direct physical interventions that are documented in the records of nuclear installations around the world. The record of UFO encounters at nuclear weapons facilities is not fringe material. It has been documented through official military records, through Freedom of Information Act disclosures, and through the testimony of decorated military officers who were directly involved in the events. Captain Robert Salas, a former Minuteman missile launch officer, has publicly described an incident at Malmstrom Air Force Base in March 1967 in which a glowing red object was observed hovering over the facility while, simultaneously and without mechanical explanation, all 10 of the nuclear warhead-equipped Minuteman missiles in his flight went into what the military calls a no-go condition, rendered completely non-functional by some means that the Air Force investigation could not explain. Similar incidents have been described by officers at Minot Air Force Base, at Vandenberg Air Force Base, and at nuclear facilities in the Soviet Union and in the United Kingdom. Robert Hastings, a researcher who has spent decades collecting and analyzing testimony from military personnel about UFO encounters at nuclear weapons facilities, has assembled a database of over 150 such incidents from the United States alone, all of them involving credible military witnesses, many of them documented in official records. The pattern is consistent. UFOs appear over nuclear storage or launch facilities. Weapons systems are temporarily disabled or rendered non-functional during the encounter, and the encounters are officially classified and officially denied. The disability is not aggressive. The weapons are returned to operational status after the objects depart. The apparent message that these weapons exist within the awareness of these beings and that they are capable of disabling them at will is not delivered through communication but through demonstration. The Alpha Centaurian framework interprets this pattern as a form of communication, a demonstration of capability combined with a demonstration of restraint. The beings are not destroying the weapons, they are showing that they could, and they are showing that they choose not to. And they are creating a record that, for those with the security clearance to see the full pattern, communicates an unmistakable message. We know about these weapons, we can affect them, and we are watching. This is not, in this framework, a threat. It is an invitation to a conversation that the governments of the nuclear powers have, by and large, refused to have in any transparent or public way. The content of Alpha Centaurian communications on the subject of human consciousness development is equally consistent and in some ways more directly actionable. The beings describe human consciousness as being in a state of arrested development, not in a demeaning way, but in a genuinely diagnostic one. The specific characteristics of human consciousness that concern them most, as reported across independent contactee accounts, are the degree to which human cognition is dominated by fear-based reactive patterns rather than by genuine reflective awareness, the identification of the self with the individual ego rather than with the larger consciousness that is the being's actual nature, the resulting tendency toward tribalism, competition, and violence that makes cooperative problem-solving at scale so difficult, and the susceptibility of human consciousness to manipulation by external influences that exploit these vulnerabilities, whether those influences are other humans, non-human beings with less benevolent agendas, or the self-reinforcing dynamics of fear and power that human institutional structures generate. The recommended trajectory that the beings describe across multiple independent accounts, with remarkable consistency of content, if not of vocabulary, involves a shift of identity from the isolated individual ego to a larger field of awareness that encompasses both more of the individual's own depth and more of the relational field in which the individual exists. This is not described as religious belief, but as something more like a perceptual skill, an expansion of the range of consciousness that is available to human beings, but that has been culturally suppressed and individually undeveloped in the dominant traditions of human civilization. The beings describe themselves as having made this transition collectively as civilizations, and as having discovered that the consequences for social organization, for decision-making, for relationship to the natural world, and for technological deployment were so transformative that virtually every problem that currently threatens human civilization would have a different character in a consciousness framework that was genuinely expanded in this direction. This is not presented as a solution to be implemented by individuals in isolation. It is described as a collective evolutionary task, something that humanity needs to accomplish as a species, not as a collection of individuals separately working on their own consciousness. The mechanisms by which this collective shift can occur, the social, educational, political, and institutional changes that would need to accompany and support it, are described in broad outline in contactee communications, but are not specified in detail, which makes sense if the being's constraint against direct interference in human affairs is genuine. They can describe the direction, they cannot make the journey. The specific agenda of Alpha Centaurian beings regarding humanity is described across contact accounts in terms of several overlapping objectives. The first and most immediate is the prevention of nuclear war or other civilization-ending catastrophe. This is consistent with the nuclear weapons demonstrations and with the communications to contactees and insiders that consistently emphasize the existential danger of the current trajectory. The second is the support, in ways consistent with the non-interference constraint of the consciousness development process described above, making themselves available as teachers, as examples, as sources of information, to the degree that they can do this without crossing into direct intervention that would violate human self-determination. The third is the broader and longer-term project of preparing humanity for incorporation into the galactic community, the recognition and acknowledgement that Earth is part of a larger inhabited cosmos, that humanity has relatives among the stars, and that the isolation in which human civilization has existed is not inevitable, but is a product of circumstances that can and will change as humanity matures. The concept of a galactic community, sometimes called the Galactic Federation or the Confederation of Planets or various other names in different contact traditions, is one of the most consistent elements of Alpha Centaurian communications across independent sources. The beings describe an organized community of civilizations spanning many star systems in this region of the galaxy that operates according to shared principles and that has an ongoing interest in the development of younger civilizations. This community is not a utopia and is not without its own conflicts and complications, but it represents a developmental stage beyond the isolated, competitive, tribally organized stage that humanity is currently in, and it is described as something humanity is expected to join eventually. The conditions for joining, as described in these accounts, are not primarily technological. The galactic community does not require a specific level of engineering sophistication. It requires a specific level of social and consciousness sophistication, the demonstrated ability to manage powerful technology without self-destruction, to organize social life without requiring the violent suppression of internal dissent, and to relate to other forms of intelligence with sufficient basic respect and understanding to make cooperation possible. These are precisely the areas in which human civilization is currently failing, which is why the relationship between humanity and the galactic community has the specific character it has. The community is present, is aware of humanity, is concerned, but is not in a position to simply admit humanity as a full member or to intervene directly to solve the problems that stand in the way of that admission. The being's description of the non-interference principle, why they cannot simply land on the White House lawn and announce their presence, why they do not provide specific technologies that would solve energy, food, and environmental problems immediately, is one of the most philosophically rich elements of the contact literature. The principle is not described as mere policy. It is described as something grounded in deep understanding of what actually helps a civilization develop and what hinders it. A civilization that receives advanced technology before it has developed the consciousness to deploy it wisely does not flourish. It fails in different and often worse ways than it would have without the gift. The history of what happens when civilizations at different developmental stages encounter each other is known to the beings from their own long history, and it is not a history that recommends the simple transfer of technology from advanced to primitive without the deeper developmental work that needs to accompany it. This is not a comfortable message for human beings accustomed to the idea of technological salvation, the belief that the right invention will solve the problems that human nature has created. The Alpha Centaurian message, consistently reported across sources, is that technological problems do require technological solutions, but that those solutions cannot be sustainably deployed without a parallel development of the consciousness that directs the technology. And the development of that consciousness is not something that can be outsourced to alien teachers or alien technology. It is something that humanity must do itself, with whatever support and guidance can be appropriately offered within the constraints of non-interference. The picture of Alpha Centaurian agenda that emerges from this survey of contact communications is one that is simultaneously hopeful and sobering. Hopeful because it describes a universe that is friendly, organized, and full of beings who genuinely care about humanity's future and who have invested enormous effort over a very long time in supporting humanity's development. Sobering because it describes a situation in which humanity is, at this moment, genuinely at risk, in which the specific combination of technological power and insufficient consciousness that characterizes the current era represents a real danger point, and in which the help that is available is genuinely limited by principles that the most advanced beings in the universe, by their own description, regard as non-negotiable. What this message does not include is equally important. It does not include the claim that humanity is helpless or hopeless. It does not include a timeline of inevitable disaster. It does not include, as far as any credible source has reported, a claim that the Alpha Centaurian beings are planning to take over, to replace human authority with their own, or to exploit humanity in ways that serve their interests at humanity's expense. The contrast with the gray-type agenda, as described in abduction research and in various insider accounts, is stark and consistent, and that contrast, between a claimed benevolent interest and a claimed exploitative interest, is one of the axes on which the entire question of Alpha Centaurian agenda turns. But the picture is not simple. Even the most positively characterized accounts of Alpha Centaurian behavior include elements that are, from a human ethical perspective, troubling. The long history of non-disclosure, of influencing human civilization in ways that were not transparent or consented to, of selecting specific individuals for contact without those individuals' prior informed consent, and of observing human suffering and catastrophe while maintaining the non-interference principle. All of these raise genuine ethical questions that are not resolved by the benevolent framing. The claim that the being's constraints are genuine and their motives are good does not fully answer the human experience of being watched, influenced, occasionally contacted without consent, and guided according to an agenda that was not disclosed or agreed to. This tension between the claimed long-term benevolence and the short-term experience of human beings who are the objects of this benevolence is one we will explore more deeply when we address the question of what has been called the spiritual agenda of the Alpha Centaurians, and when we examine the most controversial and contested element of the entire body of research: the claim that the Alpha Centaurian involvement with humanity extends not merely to guidance and observation, but to direct biological and genetic involvement with the human species itself. The genetic question, origins, and intervention. Of all the claims associated with Alpha Centaurian involvement in human affairs, none is more profound in its implications, and none has generated more controversy than the genetic hypothesis. The claim that the human species as it currently exists is not a product of purely terrestrial biological evolution, but is the result, at least in part, of deliberate genetic modification carried out by extraterrestrial beings who use the raw material of terrestrial hominid evolution to produce a species that serves purposes that are, depending on which account one examines, described variously as scientific, practical, cosmological, or deeply personal. This hypothesis has many versions, and they are not all compatible with each other. In Zecharia Sitchin's interpretation of Sumerian texts, the genetic modification was performed by the Anunnaki for a relatively mundane purpose: to create a worker species capable of performing the physical labor of gold mining that the Anunnaki required for reasons that Sitchin connects to the atmospheric needs of Nibiru, their home planet. This version of the hypothesis, while dramatic, assigns a relatively utilitarian motive to the intervention and places it in a specific historical time frame, roughly 300,000 years ago, at a period that corresponds somewhat with the appearance in the fossil record of anatomically modern or near-modern Homo sapiens. The more spiritually oriented versions of the hypothesis, which emerge from the channeled and contactee traditions associated specifically with Alpha Centaurian or related beings, assign a more elevated motive: that the genetic modification was intended to produce a being capable not merely of physical labor, but of spiritual and consciousness development, a being that combined the physical robustness of the terrestrial hominid with the neurological and energetic capacity necessary for the kind of consciousness expansion that the Alpha Centaurian beings describe as the ultimate purpose of the human experiment. Before engaging with the contactee and esoteric versions of this hypothesis, it is worth spending time with what mainstream biology actually knows about human evolution, because the biological record itself contains anomalies that are genuinely difficult to explain under a model of purely gradual natural selection. The most widely discussed of these is what researchers have called the Great Leap Forward: the apparently sudden appearance, roughly 70,000 to 100,000 years ago, of cognitive capabilities in Homo sapiens that are substantially beyond anything observable in any prior hominid species. The specific capabilities in question include fully modern language capacity, symbolic thinking, artistic production, complex social organization, and the ability to plan and execute multi-step technological processes across extended time horizons. These capabilities appear in the archaeological record in a burst that, while it has some potential precursors, represents a qualitative shift that evolutionary biologists have debated for decades without producing a satisfactory explanation in terms of purely gradual natural selection acting on random genetic variation. The genetic record adds complexity. The comparison of human and chimpanzee genomes reveals that the two species share approximately 98.7% of their DNA sequence, but that specific genomic differences account for cognitive capabilities of such an enormous qualitative difference that the 1.3% divergence is highly concentrated in specific functional domains. More puzzling is the question of chromosome 2, the human chromosomal fusion in which two ancestral ape chromosomes appear to have been fused into a single chromosome, a change that is not found in any other great ape and that represents a structural genomic difference of a kind that, under normal circumstances, tends to reduce rather than increase reproductive fitness. Yet this fusion is universal in Homo sapiens, suggesting either that it arose in a single common ancestor and all other lineages carrying the unfused chromosomes went extinct, or that the fusion was deliberately introduced across a population in a way that preserved reproductive viability despite the normal expectation of a fitness reduction. The research of anthropologist Lloyd Pye, who developed what he called the intervention theory of human origins, assembled a comprehensive collection of these genomic and anatomical anomalies and argued that their cumulative weight constitutes strong evidence for genetic intervention. Pye, who died in 2013, was not a mainstream scientist, and his work received no engagement from mainstream biology. But his specific factual claims about human genomic anomalies, the chromosome 2 fusion, the presence of 223 genes in the human genome that have no predecessors in any other species, and therefore have no evolutionary explanation in terms of gradual accumulation, the unusual distribution of certain rare and recessive genetic disorders, and several other specific features of the human genome, can be independently verified in the scientific literature and do not require acceptance of his overall theoretical framework to be acknowledged as genuine anomalies. The 223 genes point is worth examining in more detail because it has both strong and weak versions. The original claim, based on analysis published in Nature in 2001 following the completion of the first human genome sequence, was that the human genome contained a significant number of genes that appeared to have been introduced horizontally from bacteria rather than inherited vertically from any ancestral primate lineage. This horizontal gene transfer hypothesis, in which genes from bacteria directly entered the human genome, is now contested by more refined analysis that has proposed alternative explanations for some of these genes. But the broader point remains. The human genome contains elements that resist explanation in terms of standard primate evolutionary lineage, and the mechanisms by which they could have been introduced, whether bacterial horizontal transfer or some other process, remain subjects of active scientific uncertainty. The Alpha Centaurian framework does not require that all of human evolution is the result of extraterrestrial genetic engineering. The more nuanced versions of the hypothesis argue for a process of guided evolution, in which the general trajectory of hominid evolution on Earth was supplemented at specific points by genetic interventions that accelerated or directed the development of specific capabilities. This is meaningfully different from saying that humans were created from scratch. It says, instead, that the process of natural evolution, left entirely to itself, would not have produced the specific version of Homo sapiens that exists, within the time frame that exists, in precisely the form that exists, with precisely the cognitive and energetic capabilities that the Alpha Centaurian communications describe as being the specific point of the exercise. The most direct and specific version of this claim comes from the Pleiadian Alpha Centaurian contact literature as channeled and recorded by multiple independent sources. The version given most complete expression in the work of Barbara Marciniak, who has been receiving and publishing Pleiadian transmissions since the late 1980s, and who describes her sources as beings from the Pleiades star cluster who are in fact connected by various means to a larger community of civilizations that includes Alpha Centaurian lineages, describes a cosmic history in which Earth was identified billions of years ago as a site of extraordinary biological richness and potential, in which multiple extraterrestrial civilizations have been involved in the development of life on Earth from the very beginnings, and in which the specific development of the human species was a collaborative project involving genetic contributions from multiple off-world civilizations. In this framework, the human genome is literally a library of stellar genetic material, a biological archive that contains contributions from multiple different extraterrestrial lineages, encoded in the DNA in forms that have not yet been activated by human biology, and that represent potential capabilities far beyond what the current human organism expresses. The concept of junk DNA, the large proportion of the human genome that does not code for known proteins and whose function mainstream genetics has only recently begun to investigate in terms of regulatory and epigenetic mechanisms, is interpreted in this framework as the encoded archive of these dormant contributions, awaiting the conditions under which they can be expressed. This is a remarkable claim that is not currently verifiable through any mainstream scientific methodology, but it is internally consistent with a developing scientific understanding of the genome as a far more complex regulatory system than the simple gene as blueprint model of earlier molecular biology. The recent explosion of research on non-coding RNA, on epigenetic regulation, on the role of the gut microbiome in gene expression, and on the complex signaling networks that determine which genes are expressed in which contexts, has revealed a human genome of such profound functional complexity that even mainstream scientists have acknowledged that the current level of understanding represents only the beginning of an actual explanation of how the genome works. The accounts from government and military insiders about alien biology programs add a different dimension to this question. Several former participants in alleged black programs have described projects that involved the analysis of recovered alien biological material, and in at least 2 cases have described comparisons between alien and human genetic material that produced results described as either confusing or alarming. The specific claim that human genetic material is more similar to certain categories of extraterrestrial biology than it is to other Earth species. More similar, that is, than one would expect based purely on a model of fully independent terrestrial evolution, is made in several independent insider accounts with enough consistency that it cannot be completely dismissed. The reproducive or hybridization dimension of this question is the one that most directly implicates the Alpha Centaurian presence in contemporary human life. The abduction literature is saturated with accounts of what appears to be systematic biological harvesting of human reproductive material, sperm, ova, fetal tissue, by beings who conduct these procedures without consent and apparently without concern for the experience or well-being of the human subjects involved. In the standard small gray type abduction account, this reproductive agenda is one of the most consistent and most disturbing features, and it connects to the production of hybrid beings, entities that combine human and alien biological characteristics, whose purpose and fate are among the most contested questions in abduction research. The Alpha Centaurian, or Nordic type, as reported in a distinct category of contactee and abduction accounts, has a different relationship to this reproductive dimension. In several accounts, the tall, fair beings appear in the context of providing what is described as protective oversight of hybrid programs, monitoring, or in some cases, intervening to ameliorate the more traumatic aspects of gray-conducted abduction experiences. In other accounts, the Nordic beings are described as directly involved in a different kind of genetic or reproductive engagement with humanity, one that is less coercive, more oriented toward consciousness transfer or soul-level integration, and serves a purpose that is described in terms of spiritual evolutionary advancement rather than biological resource extraction. These accounts are difficult to evaluate and sit at the outer edge of the research literature's credibility, but their consistency across independent sources is notable. The most philosophically coherent version of the genetic intervention hypothesis, which draws together the ancient textual evidence, the modern contactee communications, and the specific genomic anomalies, goes something like this. The human species was designed, through a process spanning millions of years of guided biological development, to be capable of bridging 2 different orders of reality: the physical and biological reality of terrestrial life on the one hand, and the energetic and consciousness-based reality of more advanced civilizations on the other. The specific capability being developed in this framework is not merely intelligence or technology. Many terrestrial species display impressive versions of these. It is the combination of physical embodiment with a specific type of consciousness architecture that allows access to levels of perception and awareness that are otherwise only available to beings who have long since left behind the physical dimension. The human being, in this framework, is a kind of biological instrument designed to operate as a bridge between the material and the non-material, a purpose that explains both the extraordinary investment of effort that multiple civilizations have apparently made in humanity's development, and the extraordinary frustration documented in Alpha Centaurian communications with considerable specificity at how far from realizing this potential the current trajectory of human civilization is taking the species. This is the full depth of the genetic question. It goes beyond the origin of a biological species and into the question of what a human being is for in a cosmic sense. Whether humanity is an accidental outcome of evolution on a small planet, or a deliberate achievement of a cosmological process that has invested enormously in the outcome. The answer to this question is not available through current mainstream science. But the totality of the evidence, archaeological, genetic, testimonial, and theoretical, points towards something that mainstream science is not yet equipped to acknowledge, and that the best thinking in the alternative research tradition has been attempting to articulate for decades. The hidden presence among us now. One of the most startling and least discussed elements of the Alpha Centaurian phenomenon is the persistent and multi-sourced claim that some of these beings are not merely visiting Earth occasionally or monitoring from a distance, but are, at any given time, physically present on or near this planet in numbers that make them something more than rare visitors. The specific forms this presence reportedly takes vary from account to account, but the general picture that emerges from the synthesis of insider testimony, contactee reports, and certain declassified documents is of an active, sustained, covert presence that has been maintained continuously for at least the past century, and arguably for much longer. The easiest version of this claim to evaluate is the presence of craft, physical vehicles of extraterrestrial construction, in Earth's immediate environment. The evidence for this is extensive and comes from the most credible possible sources. The USS Nimitz incident of 2004, in which multiple United States Navy pilots in modern carrier-based fighter aircraft observed, engaged, and filmed a tic-tac-shaped object of extraordinary performance characteristics off the coast of San Diego, and in which the USS Princeton's advanced radar system tracked multiple such objects over a period of days, became public knowledge after the New York Times published a detailed account in December 2017. The three videos released by the Department of Defense in April 2020, the Tic Tac, the Gimbal, and the Go Fast videos, represent the first time the United States government has formally acknowledged and released footage of unidentified aerial phenomena that display capabilities beyond anything in the human technological inventory. The military and intelligence community's internal assessment of these phenomena, based on what can be pieced together from declassified documents, from congressional hearings, and from the testimony of insiders who have become public, goes considerably beyond what has been officially acknowledged. The Senate Armed Services Committee's briefings on UAP in 2020 and 2021, the establishment of the UAP Task Force, and subsequently the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, and the public congressional testimony of intelligence official David Grush in 2023 all represent steps toward an institutional acknowledgement that non-human technology of significant sophistication has been operating in Earth's environment for decades, and that the United States government has been aware of this for an equally long period. David Grush's testimony before the House Oversight Committee in July 2023 is particularly significant because Grush is a former intelligence officer with access to classified programs who made specific, formal claims under oath and under penalty of federal law that the United States government has recovered non-human craft and non-human biological material. Grush did not describe the specific origin of these craft or beings in his public testimony, citing ongoing classification, but his claim that multiple programs involving multiple legacy special access programs have been running for decades with the mission of recovering and reverse engineering non-human technology is a direct and formal assertion by a credible government insider of exactly the kind of activity that the alternative research community has been describing living for 7 decades. The physical presence hypothesis extends beyond the presence of craft to the presence of beings themselves, and here the evidence becomes more complex and more contested. The claims range from the relatively verifiable to the deeply extraordinary. On the more verifiable end, multiple credible government and military insiders have described encounters with tall, human-appearing beings in the context of their classified work. Beings who were initially not identified as non-human and who were only recognized as such on closer examination. The Robert Dean account of Nordic beings walking through secured military facilities is one example. Multiple accounts from alleged workers at classified underground facilities describe encountering beings of the tall, fair type in those facilities, sometimes in the context of what appears to be cooperative research, sometimes in contexts that are more ambiguous. On the less verifiable end, a significant body of contactee testimony describes what has come to be called the sleeper phenomenon, the claim that some Alpha Centaurian beings are living among human populations in modified physical form that makes them appear fully human, maintaining long-term identities in human society for purposes that are described variously as research, monitoring, guidance, or preparation for a planned transition in the human extraterrestrial relationship. This claim that among the billions of apparently human beings on Earth, some small number are in fact Alpha Centaurian beings in human guise is impossible to directly verify and easy to dismiss as paranoid fantasy. But it is worth noting that the same claim, in various forms, appears in multiple independent contact traditions, from the Vedic description of beings who take human form to accomplish specific cosmic purposes, the concept of the avatar, to the Hopi and other Native American traditions of star beings who live among humans for periods of time, to the specific claims of certain modern contactees who describe being told by their contacts that they themselves or certain people in their lives are such beings. The technological dimension of the hidden presence is perhaps the most significant from a practical standpoint, because it connects to the question of what human technology actually is and where some of it comes from. The reverse engineering hypothesis, the claim that significant elements of post-World War II technological development in the United States and elsewhere have been accelerated by the recovery and study of extraterrestrial technology from crash sites, has been circulating in alternative research circles since the late 1940s. The specific claims are varied and mostly unverifiable, but they center on technologies whose post-war emergence seems disproportionate to the available prior research base: transistors, integrated circuits, fiber optics, certain exotic materials, and certain advances in aerospace propulsion. Gordon Cooper, one of the original Mercury astronauts and one of the most decorated military pilots in American history, stated publicly and on the record that he was convinced the United States government had extraterrestrial technology in its possession and was actively studying it. Ben Rich, who served as the director of Lockheed's Skunk Works, the advanced aerospace development facility responsible for the U-2, the SR-71, the F-117, and other highly advanced aircraft, reportedly stated shortly before his death in 1995 that we already have the means to travel among the stars and that this technology was derived from beyond Earth. These statements have been reported by multiple witnesses to Rich's private communications in the final years of his life, though no documentary record of them exists. The underground facility network is another dimension of the hidden presence that deserves examination. Phil Schneider's testimony about the Dulce base, a facility he claimed was located beneath the town of Dulce, New Mexico, at a site where unusual geological formations create natural cavern systems that have been extended and developed into a multi-level underground complex, described a facility in which both human and extraterrestrial beings worked in uneasy coexistence on research programs whose nature Schneider described in alarming terms. The Dulce base stories cannot be independently verified, and they have the character of a legend that has accumulated details and elaborations over the decades that it has circulated. But the broader concept of shared underground facilities, locations where classified human programs interface directly with extraterrestrial technology or beings, appears in multiple independent accounts from different sources in ways that are difficult to dismiss entirely as cultural amplification of a single source. The Rendlesham Forest incident of December 1980 in England provides a well-documented case of a sustained UFO encounter involving U.S. military personnel at a nuclear weapons storage facility, and it includes elements that speak to the question of an active, communicating presence rather than a passive observation. Sergeant Jim Peniston, one of the primary witnesses, described touching a craft that landed near the base and feeling an input of binary code directly into his consciousness. A stream of zeros and ones that he wrote down obsessively in his notebook immediately afterward. When that code was finally analyzed by a computer expert decades later, it appeared to contain what could be interpreted as geographical coordinates of ancient sites, including Sedona, Arizona, the Bermuda Triangle, and the location of a site that some have connected to the concept of grid nodes, points on the planet's surface where the electromagnetic and energetic properties of the Earth are particularly concentrated. This is the kind of claim that either represents a remarkable breakthrough in understanding what these beings are communicating, or represents the overlay of pattern-seeking interpretation on ambiguous data. The honest answer is that it is not possible to be certain which of these it is. The 21st century has brought an acceleration of the hidden presence becoming visible, not through the being's own initiative in most cases, but through the technological maturation of human surveillance and recording capability. Civilian camera technology, radar networks, satellite observation systems, and the simple explosion in the number of humans with high-quality cameras in their pockets at all times have produced a volume of photographic and video documentation of anomalous aerial phenomena that dwarfs anything available in previous decades. This documentation is of highly variable quality, and the majority of it can be explained through conventional means. But the residual unexplained cases with multiple independent witnesses, corroborating radar data, interaction with known physical aircraft, and performance characteristics that definitively exceed human technical capability, have grown in volume to a degree that makes the subject impossible for any serious institution to dismiss as merely anecdotal. The transition from hidden to acknowledged that appears to be beginning in the early 21st century, represented by the Nimitz disclosures, by the Pentagon UAP reports, by the congressional hearings, and by the testimony of credible insiders, is described in certain Alpha Centaurian contact accounts as not accidental. The gradual increase in the visibility of non-human activity in Earth's skies, and the gradual movement of officially acknowledged reality toward confirming what the research community has been documenting for decades, are described by some contactees as the beginning of a deliberate, staged disclosure process, a transition from covert to acknowledged engagement that is being managed from the being's side at a pace intended to allow human institutions to adapt without catastrophic disruption. Whether this interpretation is accurate or whether the increasing visibility simply reflects technological change in both the craft being deployed and the instruments available to observe them is a question that cannot be definitively answered from the current vantage point. What is clear is that the period of complete official denial is ending. What is less clear is what will replace it, and what is deeply uncertain is whether the replacement of denial with acknowledgement will also bring, along with it, the fuller context that gives acknowledgement its meaning, the history of contact, the nature and agendas of the different groups involved, the full extent of the human extraterrestrial agreements and their consequences, and the genuine state of humanity's place in a cosmos that has been watching it for longer than most people have imagined. The spiritual agenda, consciousness, evolution, and the cosmic plan. The spiritual dimension of the Alpha Centaurian phenomenon is the one that is most easily dismissed, and that is, arguably, the most important. It is easily dismissed because it deals in concepts, consciousness, spiritual evolution, cosmic purpose, that sit outside the domain of material science and that have been exploited by fraudulent and deluded teachers across the full range of human history. But it is most important because if the Alpha Centaurian communications are genuine, then the spiritual dimension is not an appendage to the rest of the agenda. It is the agenda. Everything else, the nuclear warnings, the technological restraint, the long history of biological and cultural intervention, is in service of a goal that is fundamentally about the development of human consciousness. The concept of consciousness as the central variable in cosmic reality is one that appears in virtually every tradition of Alpha Centaurian contact, regardless of the specific cultural vocabulary in which it is expressed. The Vedic tradition describes consciousness as the fundamental ground of all existence. Brahman, the absolute, is pure awareness, and all of reality is a play of consciousness in which the individual self, Atman, and the universal self, Brahman, are ultimately identical. The Hermetic tradition describes consciousness as the primary substance of the cosmos, with material reality as a condensed form of a finer reality that is ultimately mental. The modern channeled Alpha Centaurian traditions describe consciousness as a fundamental field that underlies and in some sense precedes the physical universe, a field in which the physical universe exists as a particular region or mode of expression rather than as the whole of reality. These are not merely philosophical claims. In the context of the Alpha Centaurian framework, they have operational implications. If consciousness is a fundamental field rather than an epiphenomenon of brain chemistry, then it can be influenced, developed, and expanded in ways that have real effects on the world, on the coherence of social systems, on the relationship between intention and physical reality, and on the interface between the individual human being and the larger field of intelligence that the beings describe as the actual fabric of the cosmos. The development of human consciousness in these terms is not merely a matter of intellectual education or emotional maturity. It is a matter of expanding the range of the human being's actual perceptual and creative engagement with reality. The mechanism by which the Alpha Centaurian beings are described as supporting this development is primarily informational. They provide, through contact and communication, frameworks for understanding reality that are more accurate than the prevailing human frameworks, and they demonstrate, through their own existence and behavior, what is possible for a species that has made the consciousness shift they are describing. The effect on the human beings who have genuinely deep contact experiences with beings of this type is consistently described in the literature as transformative. Not merely intellectually interesting, but personally and existentially transforming in ways that last for decades, and that involve not only a different understanding of the cosmos, but a different experience of oneself and of one's relationship to reality. This transformative effect is documented across the full range of contact accounts, from the ancient mystical traditions in which contact with divine beings was understood to produce permanent changes in the initiate's state of being, to the modern experiencer reports in which people who have had deep encounters with tall, fair beings describe a permanent alteration in their perception of consciousness, of time, of their own identity and purpose. The consistency of this transformative dimension is itself a significant datum. The encounters change people in ways that ordinary experiences do not, in directions that are consistently associated with expanded awareness, reduced fear, increased sense of purpose, and a kind of knowing that transcends ordinary conceptual knowledge. The concept of the soul in the Alpha Centaurian framework is treated with unusual directness. In most contact accounts, the beings speak about the soul as a real, functional entity, not as a religious concept or a metaphysical supposition, but as a specific aspect of the human being's constitution that has a verifiable existence, that persists beyond the death of the physical body, and that is the specific aspect of the human being in which the Alpha Centaurian civilizations are most directly interested. The soul, in this framework, is described as the interface between the individual human experience and the larger consciousness field, the aspect of the human being that is not bound by the biological and physical constraints that bind the body, and that is, in fact, an expression of the same order of consciousness that the beings themselves embody. This is, in various terminological versions, the doctrine of most of the major human spiritual traditions. The distinctive element of the Alpha Centaurian version is that it is presented not as faith claim, but as empirical observation, as something the beings know from direct investigation and experience. They have studied the soul, they have tracked it across multiple lifetimes, they have observed its development and its relationship to the physical vehicle, and they have reached conclusions about its nature and its trajectory that they regard as scientific knowledge rather than belief. Whether this is literally true, whether beings from Alpha Centauri actually have the technology and the knowledge base to investigate human soul processes empirically, cannot be established from outside, but it is consistently claimed, and the internal consistency of the claim with both its own logic and with the broader cosmological framework of the communications gives it a credibility that pure wish fulfillment would not generate. The concept of reincarnation and the development of consciousness across multiple lives is a consistent element of the Alpha Centaurian spiritual framework. The beings describe the development of human consciousness as a multi-generational project in the literal sense that the soul of a human being does not develop the full range of its potential in a single physical lifetime, that the circumstances of each lifetime serve specific developmental purposes within a larger arc, and that the process of development across multiple embodiments is itself guided by what the beings describe as a kind of cosmic educational system in which the lessons needed for each stage of development are arranged through mechanisms that involve both the soul's own intentions between lives and the guidance of more advanced beings to appear in the physical circumstances of each successive incarnation. This is the Vedic doctrine of karma and reincarnation expressed in a framework that presents it as verifiable reality rather than religious teaching. The striking element is not merely that the Alpha Centaurian beings affirm reincarnation. Many spiritual traditions do that. It is that they describe the specific mechanism and the specific purpose in terms that connect directly to the larger cosmic project. The purpose of the cycle of incarnations in this framework is precisely the development of that expanded consciousness that makes a being capable of full participation in the galactic community. The cycle ends, in principle, when the consciousness has developed to the point where physical incarnation is no longer the most efficient vehicle for its continued development, when the being has achieved what the Vedic traditions call moksha, or liberation, and what the Alpha Centaurian communications describe as the graduation from the Earth School. The Earth School metaphor is not demeaning in the Alpha Centaurian framework, despite the reaction that some people have to it. It is descriptive. Earth, in this view, is a particularly intense and particularly rich learning environment, one in which the full range of the physical, emotional, social, and spiritual challenges of embodied existence are packed into a concentration that produces, for those who engage with it fully, a depth of experiential wisdom that more comfortable environments cannot match. The beings describe Earth as one of the most accelerated and most challenging learning environments in the galaxy precisely because of its extremity, its polarization of light and dark, its compression of evolutionary pressure, its density of physical and social experience. They express something that reads as genuine respect for what it means to live a human life, alongside the concern and frustration they express about the direction that human civilization is currently taking. The question of darkness and evil, of the existence of genuine destructive and harmful forces in the cosmos, is addressed in Alpha Centaurian communications with a directness that is uncommon in purely optimistic spiritual teachings. The beings do not deny the existence of harmful forces. They describe a cosmos in which polarization of intention, beings and forces that orient toward greater consciousness and coherent relationship with the whole, and beings and forces that orient toward control, separation, and the subordination of others is a real feature of reality at multiple levels of organization. The struggle between these orientations, which human religious and mythological traditions have encoded as the conflict between good and evil, between divine and demonic forces, is real in this framework. It is a structural feature of the developmental cosmos in which young civilizations inevitably find themselves caught. The specific form that harmful force takes in the context of the Earth situation, according to most Alpha Centaurian communications, involves the influence of beings and forces that profit from keeping human consciousness limited, fearful, and divided, that specifically work to prevent the consciousness development that would, if it occurred, remove humanity from the domain in which these forces can operate. The identity of these forces is described differently in different contact traditions, as the archons of Gnostic tradition, as the jinn of Islamic tradition, as certain categories of extraterrestrial beings who have an invested interest in humanity remaining at its current level of development, as non-physical entities that subsist on the energy of fear and conflict that is abundantly generated by human civilization in its current form. Whether these represent a single phenomenon given different names in different traditions or genuinely different categories of harmful influence is not fully clear from the communications, but the consistent theme across sources is that there is opposition to human consciousness development from forces that are not merely indifferent to humanity but are actively invested in preventing it. This introduces a dimension of the Alpha Centaurian story that is rarely discussed in the popular versions. The political dimension of cosmic reality. The beings describe a situation in which Earth is not merely a planet of developing consciousness, but a contested space, a location where different orders of intelligence with different agendas are simultaneously active, where the conflict between orientations toward greater and lesser consciousness plays out with unusual intensity, and where the outcome of that conflict has implications not merely for humanity, but for the broader galactic community. The Alpha Centaurian investment in humanity, in this framework, is not altruistic in a simple sense. It is the investment of a civilization that has aligned itself with the orientation toward greater consciousness and that recognizes in humanity's potential development an important contribution to the larger cosmic balance. This is an enormous claim. It is not verifiable by any currently available method, but it is internally consistent across dozens of independent sources. It connects to the deepest layers of virtually every human spiritual tradition, and it provides the most coherent explanatory framework for the specific pattern of Alpha Centaurian engagement with humanity. Why they care so much, why they do not simply solve the problems, why the development of consciousness is so central to everything they communicate, and why the moment we are in is described consistently and urgently as a critical turning point rather than merely another episode in a long story. The turning point theme is one of the most consistent elements of Alpha Centaurian communications from the modern era. Multiple independent sources describe the period from the mid-20th century to the first decades of the 21st century as a window, a specific period in the cosmic cycle in which the possibilities for human consciousness development are unusually concentrated and in which the consequences of the choices humanity makes, both individually and collectively, are unusually determining. This is not merely an urgent message to generate attention and action. It is described as a structural feature of where Earth and its solar system are in a long astronomical cycle, a cycle that the beings describe as a precessional period, linked to the roughly 26,000-year cycle of the equinoctial precession, during which the solar system passes through specific regions of the galactic environment that have specific effects on the consciousness field available to life on Earth. The 2012 phenomenon, the intense cultural focus on the Mayan long count calendar's completion of a major cycle on December 21, 2012, was, in the most credible Alpha Centaurian contact accounts, not a prediction of catastrophe, but a recognition of this astronomical threshold. The Mayan calendar's long count cycle corresponds with remarkable precision to the precessional cycle, and the completion of a major long count period represents, in the Mayan astronomical tradition and in the Alpha Centaurian framework that illuminates it, the transition from one phase of the galactic year to another. A transition that, according to these accounts, makes certain kinds of consciousness development that were more difficult in the previous phase more accessible in the current one, and that represents the specific window of opportunity that the urgency of Alpha Centaurian communications is directed at. Whether this cosmic cycle model is literally accurate is not something that can be established with current scientific instruments, which are not designed to detect or measure the kinds of galactic-scale consciousness field variations that the model describes. What can be observed is that the period from roughly 2010 onward has indeed seen, by any measure, an acceleration in human awareness of non-human presence, in the dismantling of the institutional denial of that presence, in the global spread of contemplative and consciousness development practices, and in a broadly expressed sense across many different human communities that something fundamental about the situation is shifting. Whether this reflects the cosmic cycle model or merely the specific confluence of digital information technology, growing institutional transparency, and accumulated pressure from an unexplained phenomenon, is a question that this documentary cannot definitively answer. What it can say is that the full picture of Alpha Centaurian involvement with humanity, from the ancient genetic interventions to the modern communications, from the nuclear demonstrations to the consciousness teachings, from the hidden presence to the gradual disclosure, coheres into a story that is simultaneously grander and more intimate than the popular image of alien contact usually allows. It is a story in which humanity is not an accident, is not alone, and is not without help. But it is also a story in which the help available is limited by principles that the most advanced intelligences in the universe regard as sacred, and in which the outcome depends, in the most fundamental way, on choices that only human beings can make. The opposition, competing groups, and the dark agenda. The picture that has been building across the preceding sections is one in which Alpha Centaurian beings represent a genuinely benevolent presence in human affairs, advanced, concerned, constrained by their own principles, and working within those constraints toward the goal of human consciousness development and eventual integration into a larger cosmic community. This picture is real in the sense that it accurately reflects what the best and most consistent sources in the field report about this specific category of being, but it is incomplete in a way that matters enormously for any honest assessment of the extraterrestrial situation. Because the evidence is also clear across the same body of research that the Alpha Centaurian or Nordic type is not the only non-human presence active in the Earth environment, and the other presences that the evidence documents are not all oriented by the same principles or motivated by the same agenda. The full reality of the extraterrestrial situation, as it emerges from the synthesis of the best available sources, is considerably darker, considerably more complex, and considerably more politically contentious than any single narrative account allows. We need to be honest about the categories here. The research literature distinguishes, at minimum, between several broad types of non-human intelligence with documented relationships to Earth. The small grays, which appear in the abduction literature, with a frequency and consistency that makes them the most widely reported extraterrestrial type, are associated in various accounts with the Zeta Reticuli system, with a reported evolutionary trajectory that involved the sacrifice of biological diversity and emotional capacity in favor of technological development and hive mind efficiency, and with an agenda that centers primarily on their own species' survival and reproduction, which, according to the most developed versions of the hypothesis, has become dependent on the genetic material of other biological species because their own biological vitality has been severely compromised. The relationship between the Greys and humanity in this framework is not one of benevolent elder to developing younger, but one of resource manager to resource, a relationship that is not hostile in the manner of predator to prey, but is radically indifferent to human consent, well-being, or self-determination in ways that the Alpha Centaurian framework explicitly rejects. The relationship between the Greys and the Alpha Centaurian, or Nordic type, is described in various accounts as ranging from tense tolerance to active conflict, mediated in some cases by the United States government and other powerful human institutions that have found themselves in the awkward position of having entered agreements with both. The insider accounts that speak to this tripartite structure consistently describe the Alpha Centaurian beings as having deep reservations about the human Grey agreements and as having attempted, through various channels to communicate those reservations to human authorities who were either unable or unwilling to act on them. The reptilian hypothesis adds another layer of complexity that cannot be avoided in an honest treatment of the subject, however much it has been degraded in popular culture by its association with the most extreme and poorly documented versions of conspiracy theory. The concept of a reptilian or saurian intelligent species, separate from the gray type and the humanoid Nordic type, appears in the research literature through multiple independent pathways. It is present in ancient mythological and religious traditions from multiple cultures. The Naga of Hindu and Buddhist tradition, the Anunnakis described reptilian characteristics in certain Sumerian accounts, the serpent beings of Mesoamerican tradition, the dragon figures of East Asian cosmology. It appears in independent contactee and abduction accounts from witnesses who were clearly not aware of each other's testimony. It appears in several alleged government insider accounts that describe encounters with beings of a saurian physical type in classified facilities, and it appears in certain channeled communications as a description of a category of intelligence that is associated with the manipulation of human political and financial structures for purposes of continued human disempowerment. The factual question whether a reptilian type of extraterrestrial intelligence is genuinely active in Earth's affairs cannot be definitively answered from the available public evidence. What can be said is that the evidence for its existence is more substantial than the popular dismissal of the concept allows, that multiple independent sources describe it in similar terms, and that the specific behavioral characteristics attributed to this category, a highly developed capacity for strategic thinking, an interest in dominance hierarchies and control structures, and an approach to other species that treats them primarily as resources to be managed, are consistent across sources in ways that, if the phenomenon is purely imaginary, require an explanation for the consistency that is as interesting as the phenomenon itself. The dark agenda hypothesis, the claim that certain non-human intelligences are not merely self-interestedly indifferent to humanity, but are actively working to prevent human consciousness development because a fully conscious, fully empowered humanity would no longer be manageable in ways that serve their interests, is the most disturbing element of the full extraterrestrial picture. It is also, arguably, the element with the most direct and immediately practical implications for human life, because if it is accurate, then many aspects of human civilization that appear to be the products of purely internal human dynamics, the persistence of war and poverty, the systematic undermining of educational and information systems, the specific nature of the manipulation of human fear and tribalism in political and media contexts, have a dimension that goes beyond ordinary human malfeasance. The connection between certain human power structures and non-human agendas is one of the most contested elements of the field. At its most extreme, in the version popularized by figures like David Icke, which involves literal shape-shifting reptilian beings occupying the bodies of prominent human leaders, it has no credible evidentiary support and represents a form of conspiratorial thinking that is frankly dangerous in its potential for generating scapegoating and social harm. But stripped of its most extreme elaborations, the underlying claim that certain human institutional structures have, whether through genuine contact, through long historical cultivation by non-human intelligences, or through the independent development of behavioral patterns that align with non-human agendas, come to operate in ways that systematically prevent the very developments that the Alpha Centaurian and related beings are trying to support, is one that the serious research tradition cannot entirely dismiss. The secret society and hidden power structure dimension of this hypothesis is the one most deserving of careful analysis because it operates at the intersection of the extraterrestrial question and ordinary human political reality. Multiple researchers, Richard Dolan, Peter Levenda, Jim Marrs, and others, have documented the historical connections between the UFO secrecy apparatus and the broader infrastructure of post-World War II American intelligence, corporate, and political power. The secrecy around UFOs has never been maintained purely for the stated reason of preventing public panic. The nature and intensity of the cover-up, the witness intimidation, the evidence retrieval, the deliberate disinformation campaigns, the infiltration of civilian research organizations, suggest that the motivation goes considerably beyond public relations management. It suggests that what is being protected is not merely information that might disturb people, but information that would, if widely understood, fundamentally challenge the legitimacy and the rationale of specific power structures that have a great deal to lose from genuine public understanding of the extraterrestrial situation. The specific elements that those power structures most want to keep hidden are, according to insiders who have risked everything to speak about them, the reality and terms of the government agreements with non-human intelligences, the nature and extent of reverse-engineered technology that has been developed but not released, the history of human contact with non-human beings that goes back further than officially acknowledged, and the ongoing programs of covert monitoring and management of human experience by certain non-human intelligences that the agreements have failed to constrain. These are not abstractions. They are, if accurate, specific factual situations that have had and are having direct effects on human life, effects that include the technological suppression of energy technologies that could solve the global energy crisis, the denial of medical and biological information that could transform human health, and the continuation of programs of experimentation on human subjects that no legitimate government should have permitted. The Alpha Centaurian beings' relationship to these darker dimensions of the extraterrestrial situation is described in contact accounts as one of genuine concern and limited ability to directly intervene. They are not powerless. The nuclear demonstration incidents suggest a level of technological capability that could, theoretically, override most human or non-human opposition to any particular course of action. But their commitment to the non-interference principle is genuine and is not easily abandoned even in the face of serious harm to humanity, because the principle is grounded in their understanding of what actually helps civilizations develop and what hinders that development in ways that have long-term consequences that outweigh the short-term benefits of direct intervention. This is the most philosophically difficult element of the entire picture. It requires holding simultaneously a picture of beings who are genuinely advanced, genuinely concerned, and genuinely constrained, and a picture of a situation in which that constraint, however principled, allows harm to human beings that would not occur if the constraint were relaxed. The beings themselves, in various contact accounts, acknowledge this tension and describe it as one of the most difficult aspects of their relationship to humanity. They do not experience the non-interference principle as comfortable. They experience it as a discipline that is genuinely costly, that they maintain because they are convinced its long-term wisdom outweighs its immediate costs, and that they are constantly assessing for whether any specific situation warrants an exception. The exceptions that are acknowledged in contact accounts include the nuclear demonstrations, which are described as justified by the dimensional harm criterion, the claim that nuclear weapons cause effects that extend beyond the Earth system and therefore cannot be regarded as purely an internal human affair. They include certain categories of intervention in natural disasters and environmental processes that have been attributed to Alpha Centaurian technology, though these are harder to document independently. And they include the ongoing process of communication itself, the choice to maintain contact with selected human individuals, to provide information through that contact that guides those individuals' development and their influence on the broader human situation, and to gradually increase the visibility and volume of that communication as the urgency of the current moment warrants. The question of who the selected individuals are, who gets contact, who gets communication, and on what basis these choices are made, is one of the elements that generates the most discomfort in human responses to this material. The idea that some humans are chosen for contact and others are not, and that the criteria for this selection are determined by the beings rather than by the humans, strikes many people as elitist and paternalistic at best, and as a form of manipulation at worst. The beings' accounts of the selection criteria, as reported in contact literature, include apparent previous life connections with the beings, specific soul-level agreements made before the current incarnation, specific combinations of capabilities and life circumstances that make a particular individual well-suited to receive and transmit certain kinds of information, and proximity to situations or knowledge domains that are relevant to the being's specific communications at a given time. Whether these selection criteria are as benign and as conscientiously applied as described, or whether the process involves forms of manipulation that the beings are either unaware of or are not fully disclosing, is a question that the evidence cannot definitively resolve. What is observable is that the human beings who report the most consistent and most positive contact experiences with the Nordic type tend to be people who are fundamentally oriented toward consciousness development, who are not seeking power or status through their contact experiences, who are genuinely motivated by the well-being of the broader human community, and who have a kind of internal stability that allows them to integrate extraordinary experiences without being destabilized. This profile suggests a selection process that is, if not perfectly benign, at least oriented toward beings who can handle the contact productively rather than destructively. The full picture that emerges from an honest examination of both the Alpha Centaurian phenomenon and the broader extraterrestrial landscape that surrounds it is one that resists any simple characterization. It is neither the Hollywood alien invasion narrative nor the New Age angelic beings story. It is a complex, politically contested, multi-party situation in which Earth is a significant piece of a much larger cosmic game board, in which multiple forms of intelligence with genuinely different agendas are active, in which humanity is simultaneously a ward, a resource, a project, an experiment, and a potentially important player, and in which the choices that humanity makes, individually and collectively, in the current period, have implications that extend far beyond what conventional human political analysis imagines. The appropriate response to this picture is not panic, and it is not the paralysis that can come from feeling overwhelmed by forces too large to engage with. It is something more like the response that the Alpha Centaurian communications themselves consistently recommend: clear-eyed awareness of the full situation, conscious development of the inner resources that make good choices possible, and active engagement with the immediate human world in ways that contribute to the trajectory of greater coherence, greater consciousness, and greater genuine community that represents the direction the most advanced intelligences in this region of the galaxy regard as the purpose of the human project. The disclosure trajectory: where we are and what comes next. The movement toward official acknowledgement of the extraterrestrial reality, what the research community calls disclosure, has been accelerating in ways that are measurable, documentable, and in some cases surprising even to those who have been working toward it for decades. The pace of the acceleration since approximately 2017 represents a qualitative shift from the slow drip of information that characterized the preceding 70 years, and it raises a set of questions about what is happening, why now, and where it is going that this documentary needs to address directly. The 2017 New York Times article about the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, the $22 million Pentagon program that ran from 2007 to 2012 and investigated UAP, and that was publicly known previously to almost no one, was significant not merely for its content, but for its framing. The Times did not treat the story as a fringe topic. It ran it on the front page, with the cooperation of the program's funding champion, Senator Harry Reid, and with video evidence released by the Department of Defense itself. The mainstream media treatment of the story, which was almost universally respectful, without the dismissive framing that had characterized mainstream coverage of UFO stories for decades, was a signal that something had shifted. What shifted is open to interpretation. One interpretation is that the information environment had simply become untenable, that the accumulation of credible evidence, the quality of witnesses coming forward, and the public's increasing awareness of the subject had made continued full denial impossible to maintain with credibility. Another interpretation, favored by some researchers, is that elements within the intelligence community had decided that partial disclosure served certain institutional interests, that acknowledging the UAP phenomenon while keeping the most sensitive details classified, was a strategy for managing the issue in a way that preserved institutional authority over the narrative. A third interpretation, more aligned with the Alpha Centaurian contact tradition, is that the disclosure process is itself being managed in part from the non-human side, that the beings have been gradually increasing the frequency and quality of their visible activity in ways that are pushing the human institutional capacity for denial past its breaking point. The congressional hearing featuring David Grush and two other military pilots, Ryan Graves and David Fravor, in July 2023 was a landmark event in the formal public record. For the first time, an intelligence officer testified before Congress, under oath, that the U.S. government had recovered non-human craft and non-human biological material. Fravor and Graves, both decorated Navy pilots with impeccable military records, described their own direct visual encounters with objects of extraordinary performance that could not be human technology. The hearing was bipartisan, serious, and treated with a level of respect by committee members that would have been unimaginable 10 years earlier. The institutional shift that the hearing represented, from a subject that no serious official would touch to a subject being actively investigated by the legislative branch of the world's most powerful government, is a measure of how far the disclosure trajectory has traveled. The specific claims that Grush made about legacy special access programs, about the depth and duration of the secrecy, about the existence of non-human intelligence and technology in government possession have not been publicly refuted by any official with access to the classified information. They have been officially non-confirmed, which is different. The Department of Defense has issued statements saying that Grush's specific claims could not be confirmed through official channels, but no official has appeared before Congress to say, under oath, that Grush is wrong. The absence of authoritative official rebuttal in a government that has historically been willing to aggressively rebut claims it regarded as genuinely false is itself a datum. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office and its successors, established by the 2022 National Defense Authorization Act and subsequent legislation, represent the first formally congressionally mandated investigation of UAP in American history, with a genuine reporting requirement. The reports produced by these offices are uneven, reflecting the ongoing tension between institutional transparency and classification interests, but their existence represents an institutionalization of the subject that is unprecedented and that creates a permanent congressional mandate for the government to address the question in a way that has not previously existed. The global dimension of the disclosure trajectory deserves attention. The United States is not the only government dealing with these questions, and is not, arguably, the one that has been most forthcoming. France's JAIPAN, the official UAP investigation office of the French space agency CNES, has been operating publicly since 1977 and has produced reports acknowledging genuinely unexplained cases. Brazil, Mexico, Chile, Uruguay, and several other South American countries have had formal military UAP investigation programs and have released documents acknowledging encounters that cannot be explained conventionally. The Chilean CIFA produced in 2014 a video taken by Navy helicopter crew during a routine coastal patrol that showed a UAP exhibiting performance characteristics and thermal signatures that a panel of Chilean aeronautical and scientific experts spent 2 years analyzing and could not explain by any conventional means. The institutional momentum of disclosure does not guarantee that what is disclosed will be accurate or complete. The history of official handling of the UAP subject suggests a strong institutional preference for providing just enough acknowledgement to manage the narrative while keeping the most significant information classified indefinitely. The specific question of what will happen when the Alpha Centaurian connection, the specific identity and agenda of the beings behind the most consistent and most positively reported category of contact, becomes part of the official public discourse, is one that no one in the public sphere has yet seriously engaged with. The implications of genuine, comprehensive disclosure are staggering in their scope. Every major institution of human civilization would be affected. Religion would face the challenge of integrating the reality of a cosmos full of intelligent beings into frameworks that have, for the most part, been organized around the premise of human uniqueness in a divinely created world. Science would face the challenge of acknowledging that there are forms of physical reality and technology that do not fit within current theoretical frameworks, and that require a fundamental revision of the materialist premises of the scientific establishment. Governance and geopolitics would face the challenge of coordinating a response to a situation in which the most powerful entities involved are not human nations, but extraterrestrial civilizations, with agendas and capabilities that dwarf any national power. The economic implications alone are world-transforming. If the energy technologies associated with advanced propulsion systems, technologies that, if the reverse engineering hypothesis is accurate, are already in classified existence, were to be released into the public domain, the global energy economy would be transformed in ways that would make the existing fossil fuel and nuclear industry infrastructure obsolete within a generation. The political and economic powers that are invested in the current energy system are exactly the powers that have the most to lose from disclosure, which provides a direct and entirely mundane political explanation for why the classified programs have maintained their secrecy as vigorously as they have. The medical and biological implications of disclosure are equally profound. If the hypothesis of genetic involvement by extraterrestrial beings is accurate, and if the documentation of that involvement includes specific information about the capabilities of the human genome and the biological mechanisms of consciousness development that have been kept classified, the implications for medicine, for psychology, for understanding of consciousness and its relationship to the body, and for the fundamental human understanding of what a human being is, would be world-altering. The Alpha Centaurian beings, in the most consistent and credible accounts, have communicated specific views about how disclosure should happen. They do not recommend a sudden, unmanaged revelation. They do not recommend the continuation of indefinite secrecy. What they recommend, in the accounts that address this specifically, is a process of gradual, managed, honest communication that begins with the acknowledgement of their existence, moves through the provision of accurate historical context, and builds toward a genuine conversation between humanity as a whole and the civilizations that have been involved with it, a conversation that has not been possible as long as the reality of those civilizations was officially denied by the institutions that claim to represent humanity's interests. Whether the institutions of human governance are capable of managing such a process with the honesty and the long-term perspective it requires is a question that the history of those institutions does not fully reassure. The management of the extraterrestrial secret since 1947 has not been characterized by either honesty or long-term wisdom. It has been characterized by the same combination of short-term institutional interest, bureaucratic inertia, and genuine uncertainty that characterizes most institutional responses to situations they are not equipped to handle. The hope that lies in the current disclosure trajectory is that the accumulation of public awareness, the growing transparency of the evidence, and the courage of specific individuals who are willing to risk their careers and, in some cases, their lives to speak about what they know is creating a pressure on the institutional structure that will eventually force a level of honesty that has so far been avoided. The Alpha Centaurian perspective on this process, as reflected in recent contact accounts, is described as cautiously optimistic. The beings observe that the trajectory has shifted, that the institutional denial is cracking in ways that are not reversible, and that the human public's capacity to engage with the reality of their cosmic situation without collective panic is considerably greater than the fear-based institutional response has assumed. They are described as waiting, not passively, but actively, and with something that reads as genuine impatience, for the moment at which a genuine dialogue becomes possible, in which the history, the agenda, and the full context of their involvement with humanity can be communicated in a way that serves human understanding rather than merely serving institutional narratives. What comes next is, in the most honest sense, unknown. The disclosure trajectory is real and is accelerating, but its outcome is not predetermined. The specific contours of what will be acknowledged, by whom, in what order, and with what framing will be the result of the interplay between institutional interests, public pressure, and the ongoing engagement of non-human intelligences who have their own views about how this process should unfold. The hope that the Alpha Centaurian contact tradition consistently expresses is that the outcome will serve the deeper purpose that their involvement with humanity has always been aimed at. Not the revelation of alien presence as an end in itself, but as the beginning of a context in which the actual purpose of that presence, the support of human consciousness development, the integration of humanity into a larger cosmic community, and the realization of what humanity was always meant to become, can be openly and honestly pursued. The final reckoning, implications, responsibilities, and the future. We have traveled across the preceding sections of this documentary through a body of evidence and testimony that touches the deepest layers of what it means to be human. We have examined ancient texts that encode encounters with beings from beyond the ordinary human world. We have traced the thread of contact through the historical record, through religious and mystical traditions, through the modern contactee and abduction literature, through government insider accounts, and through the accelerating official acknowledgement of non-human presence in Earth's environment. We have looked at the specific nature of Alpha Centaurian beings as they are described across all of these sources, their physical appearance, their behavior, their communication, their agenda, and their relationship to the broader and darker dimensions of the extraterrestrial situation. And we have arrived at a point where the implications of everything assembled here need to be addressed directly. The first implication is the most fundamental. If even a substantial fraction of what has been presented in this documentary is accurate, then the single most important fact about the situation of contemporary humanity is that we are not alone. We have never been alone. And the question of who else is in this cosmos and what their relationship to us is not merely an interesting speculative topic, but the defining strategic context of human existence at this moment. Every major decision that human civilization makes about energy, about governance, about technology, about resource distribution, about conflict and cooperation, is being made inside a context that is invisible to most of the people making those decisions, and that would, if visible, transform both the decisions and the understanding of what is at stake in making them. This is not a small thing to hold. It is, by any measure, the largest single adjustment to human self-understanding that has ever been required. Every previous expansion of human cosmological awareness, the discovery that the Earth is not the center of the solar system, the discovery that the Sun is not at the center of the galaxy, the discovery that our galaxy is one among hundreds of billions, required humanity to become smaller in its own eyes. This discovery requires something different. It requires becoming larger, not in arrogance, but in genuine recognition that the human project is part of something considerably more vast, more intentional, and more coherent than the current human self-image allows. The second implication concerns agency and responsibility. If the Alpha Centaurian communications are accurate, if the development of human consciousness is genuinely the central variable in whether humanity navigates the current period successfully, and if the help available from more advanced civilizations is genuinely limited by the non-interference principle, then the responsibility for what happens next falls where it has always fallen, on human beings themselves. The temptation, once aware of the larger cosmic context, is to either wait for intervention from beings who care about humanity's fate, or to feel helpless against forces too large to influence. Both responses are, in the Alpha Centaurian framework, forms of the same mistake, the abdication of the human agency that is the specific capacity being developed through the human experiment in the first place. The beings are clear about this across all contact accounts that address it. They can provide information, they can provide examples of what is possible. They can intervene in specific extreme situations that exceed the non-interference threshold. But they cannot make the choices that need to be made, cannot develop the consciousness that needs to be developed. and cannot build the world that needs to be built on behalf of human beings whose specific evolutionary task is to make those choices, develop that consciousness, and build that world with the full weight of their own agency. The responsibility is not merely political or social, it is spiritual in the deepest sense. It is the responsibility of the human soul in its collective form to become what it was always meant to be. The third implication concerns what to do with the information presented in this documentary. The response to material of this kind varies enormously among different people, and all of the responses are understandable. Some people will dismiss it entirely. The institutional and epistemological frameworks in which they live provide no accommodation for this material, and the cognitive dissonance required to hold it alongside the ordinary assumptions of modern life is more than they are prepared to manage. Some people will be overwhelmed. The scale and the urgency of the implications will produce a kind of paralysis, a sense of being too small and too isolated to do anything meaningful in a situation this large. Some people will already have known, at some level, that something like this was true. For these people, the documentary serves not as revelation, but as confirmation and articulation of something that their own experience, their own intuition, or their own contact has already suggested. And some people will find in this material neither dismissal, nor paralysis, nor mere confirmation, but something more like calling, a recognition that understanding the actual situation of humanity in its cosmic context is not merely an interesting thing to know, but a basis for different action, different priorities, and a different quality of engagement with the specific circumstances of the life they are living. It is this last response that the Alpha Centaurian communications, across all their variations, seem most oriented toward generating. Not a mass movement, not a new religion, not a political faction, but a sufficient number of individual human beings who are informed, awake, and genuinely committed to the consciousness development and the world building that the current moment requires. The fourth implication concerns the institutions of human knowledge and governance. The scientific establishment, the political establishment, and the religious establishments of the world all have a stake in how the extraterrestrial reality is ultimately acknowledged and integrated. Each of them faces the requirement to revise, sometimes substantially, the frameworks within which they have been operating. The scientific requirement is the most straightforward in principle, though not in practice. Science must expand its ontology to accommodate forms of intelligence and forms of physical reality that its current materialist framework cannot accommodate. This is not a defeat for science, but a maturation, the same kind of maturation that the incorporation of quantum mechanics represented for classical physics, only larger. The political requirement is more complex. Governance structures that have been maintained in part on the basis of information that has been withheld from their citizens cannot simply transition to full transparency without consequence. The specific question of how the agreements made with non-human intelligences are to be evaluated and renegotiated, who has the authority to conduct that renegotiation, and how the interests of all of humanity rather than merely the governments that made the original agreements are to be represented. These are genuinely difficult political problems that will require new institutional forms to address. The development of those forms is itself a dimension of the consciousness development that the moment requires. The religious requirement is perhaps the deepest, because it touches not merely institutional frameworks, but the most fundamental dimensions of human meaning. The major religious traditions have, in varying degrees and in various ways, carried through history something of the true cosmic context of human existence, encoded in mythological and theological language that protected and preserved it through periods when more explicit expression would have been impossible. As the explicit reality of the cosmic context becomes more available, the task of religion is not to become irrelevant, but to complete its own translation, to recover from beneath the accretions of centuries of institutional development the core insight that was always there, that human beings are not alone, that the cosmos is conscious and purposeful, that the development of consciousness is the deepest purpose of human existence, and that the intelligence that created and sustains this purpose is real, is caring, and is more than can be adequately described in any human language. The fifth and final implication is the most intimate. It is the question of what each individual who encounters this material does with it in the context of their own life. This is not a question that can be answered by a documentary. It is a question that each person has to answer for themselves in the specific circumstances of their specific life, with the specific capacities and limitations and relationships that define their particular human experience. What can be said is that the Alpha Centaurian message, as it has come through the full range of sources examined here, is consistently oriented toward a specific kind of response. Not fear, not awe, not passivity, but engaged, clear-eyed, compassionate, consciousness-driven participation in the life of this planet and this civilization at this extraordinary moment. The beings who have been watching this planet for longer than any human tradition can clearly remember have watched humanity through every catastrophe, every period of darkness, every failure of compassion and wisdom that fills the historical record. They have not given up. They are described in contact accounts with something that, filtered through the limitations of the contact experience and the limitations of human language to convey it accurately, reads as love. Not the sentimental version, but the demanding kind, the kind that holds someone to their highest possibility rather than accommodating their lowest performance, the kind that refuses to stop believing in what someone can become, even when the evidence of what they currently are is difficult to bear. The question is whether humanity can find, in the current moment, enough of its own capacity for that kind of love, toward itself, toward this planet, toward the future generations who will inherit what the current generation decides, to make the choices that the moment requires. The Alpha Centaurian framework does not guarantee any particular outcome. It describes a window of possibility, not a predetermined destination. The destination depends on what human beings choose to do with the window they currently have. What the full body of evidence assembled in this documentary suggests is that the window is real, the stakes are real, and the support available from the cosmos is real, limited, principled, and genuinely caring in a way that is more profound than human beings have generally been able to credit. The evidence suggests that we are not accidents, that we are not abandoned, and that the work of becoming what we were always meant to be is the most important work any human being has ever been asked to do. It is happening now. It is happening in every human life that chooses clarity over confusion, compassion over fear, genuine engagement over comfortable numbness. The stars are closer than they appear, and the closest star of all has been watching, has been concerned, has been engaged, and is waiting in the patient, principled way that only very old and very wise civilizations can wait. For the moment when the conversation that has been happening across the full span of human history, in fragments and in secret and in code, can finally become open, honest, and truly mutual. That moment is not guaranteed. It is being built, piece by piece, in the choices of individual human beings who are willing to see clearly and act from what they see. That is the Alpha Centaurian message in its fullest and most honest form. It is a message about responsibility, it is a message about consciousness, and it is, ultimately, a message about what it means to grow up, not as an individual, but as a species, in a universe that has been waiting, with extraordinary patience and genuine hope, for that growing up to begin in earnest. Key sources, researchers, and further investigation. For those who wish to pursue the investigation further, the following represent the most substantive and most credible sources across the different domains of evidence this documentary has drawn upon. They range from peer-reviewed scientific publications to government documents obtained through FOIA to first-hand witness accounts, and they represent a starting point rather than a complete bibliography. On the astronomical and physical dimensions, the work of Paul Davies in The Eerie Silence and Are We Alone provides a rigorous scientific framework for thinking about extraterrestrial intelligence, as does the work of Frank Drake and Carl Sagan, whose public skepticism about ETI was accompanied by private acknowledgement of the genuine likelihood of its existence. The discovery papers for Proxima b and subsequent Alpha Centauri system planetary candidates are available through the Arxiv preprint server and represent the most current scientific understanding of the system's potential habitability. On the ancient evidence, Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods and later works provide the most comprehensive synthesis of anomalous ancient history, drawing on mainstream archaeological and geological evidence to make the case for a lost prehistoric civilization. Robert Bauval's The Orion Mystery addresses the astronomical encoding of Egyptian monuments. John Lash's Not in His Image provides a detailed analysis of Gnostic texts and their relevance to the question of non-human intelligences. Zechariah Sitchin's Earth Chronicles series, despite its methodological controversies, represents the most detailed attempt to read Sumerian texts as a record of extraterrestrial contact. On the modern contact and abduction phenomena, Whitley Strieber's Communion and its sequels represent the most articulate and most self-analytically honest account of sustained contact experience by any single witness. Bud Hopkins's Missing Time and Intruders document the abduction phenomenon from a researcher's perspective. John Mack's Abduction represents the most rigorous psychological investigation of the phenomenon by a mainstream academic, a Harvard psychiatrist who risked his career and his reputation to take the experiencers seriously. Jacques Vallée's Passport to Magonia and Dimensions provide the most sophisticated cross-cultural and cross-historical analysis of the phenomenon. On the government documentation, Richard Dolan's UFOs and the National Security State volumes represent the most comprehensive and most rigorously sourced history of the UFO cover-up, drawing almost entirely on declassified documents and on-record testimony. Timothy Good's Above Top Secret and subsequent works draw on global official documentation and credible insider testimony. Stephen Greer's Disclosure Project represents the largest coordinated collection of military and government witness testimony, though Greer's own interpretive framework and certain aspects of his later work have generated controversy within the research community. On the Alpha Centaurian and Nordic contact tradition specifically, the work of Barbara Marciniak in Bringers of the Dawn and Earth provides the most fully developed channeled account of the Pleiadian Alpha Centaurian perspective. The Meyer contact notes, available in English translation, represent the most voluminous first-person account of sustained humanoid extraterrestrial contact, whatever one's assessment of their ultimate reliability. Robert Dean's public presentations, available in recorded form, provide the most direct insider account of governmental knowledge of the Nordic type. The congressional testimony of David Grush, Ryan Graves, and David Fravor before the House Oversight Committee on July 26, 2023 is available in full transcript through the House of Representatives official records and represents the current leading edge of official institutional acknowledgement of the extraterrestrial reality. The investigation continues. The evidence accumulates. The window remains open. The choice of what to do with the awareness that this evidence generates belongs, as it has always belonged, to human beings who are living through one of the most consequential periods in their species' long and extraordinary history. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.